In a world where a host can't even operate his own microphone, a suit costs $400, and nobody knows what time it is, despite the clock that's literally built into the show, one man has the courage to stand up and say, it's in time, not on time.
Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me, as always, is Xandring. Xandring, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing okay. Enjoying some, or at least coming up on enjoying some home time.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you don't, as in we've had that conversation before, but it's hard for, you spend so much time away from home and people don't think. We're going to talk a lot about truckers today, I think so, but it's been a learning experience hearing what that world is really like, because that's a different fucking world. That is something, and none of the rules apply. There's all we're gonna get into that, but yeah, that's a tough business too. That's a really fucking hard business. But at any rate, so we're going to get into that, and then lots of shit to talk about tonight. If you're just joining us, you know what? Hit the like and subscribe button. It's a really great way to help out. Nobody likes to like beg for those, but we do need them. So I hope you guys will remember to do that. And if you like the content, just share. That's the greatest way to get other people in on it, and it really does help us out a lot too. So next week we're going to have Homozygote, and we're going to have him and philosophy professor are going to be on. We're going to do another on philosophy series. We're going to be talking about the philosophy of science, which I think should be a lot of fun. So that is going to be next week. Looking forward to that. Got a couple other shows that we're working on, so I think we're gonna have a good time there. Now, and we should do an After Dark. We did an After Dark. We did an impromptu After Dark on Friday. I'm hoping we can do. Or when did we do it? I don't even remember. And you didn't get your notifications because your computer doesn't like you. Let's see, where's the yeah. So we'll do another one of those, and we'll talk whatever anybody wants to talk about. There's plenty of controversy both on In Time and off. Oh yeah, try being a trucker's wife. It's not a cakewalk, as they say. The only thing tougher than a trucker is well, and they say that about the Marines too. My sister was a Marine wife for quite some time, and that was eye opening too. I had no idea. You really don't know. It's that walking in someone else's shoes, but trucking I think is really we're going to get into it. It's I don't think. It's something I didn't understand well, and you've made some arguments for some laws that I was just like, well, who cares? And they're like, well, here's who cares. It's like, oh, that's a really good fucking point. So we'll get into that. So I think some of the biggies, for me, one of the biggies, well, so far right now, Ukraine yesterday said that they had gotten a timeline for the invasion, and it was planned for Wednesday the 16th, which would be tomorrow. And then today they said that Russia has notified them they're pulling troops back. I don't believe anything anyone in Russia says for any number of reasons, and all of them are pretty good, I think. But and so far we have no evidence that they're pulling back. I hope that the president of Ukraine isn't just sort of making shit up, but who knows at this point. That whole region has kind of a tendency to do that. We've talked about that. When you're under a secret police, it discourages honesty for any reason. Lie about the weather if you can, just to practice lying. It's an interesting culture. We'll see. I have no idea what's going on over there, but they say right now that they are that Ukraine says that Russia has told them that they're going to be withdrawing troops. Last we saw, they were moving artillery into final firing positions. So we'll see. Trump's accounting firm has said that 10 years of financial statements are now unreliable and should not be used by anybody for any reason. That's a bold statement. We'll be getting into that. And then let's see, the Fox News has been lying like fucking crazy about the truckers. I want to talk a bit about the truckers today and a few other things, so we'll get about that. But Fox News has just been, and whatever you want to say about them, and we're going to get into them. It's let's see. Oh, yep. Okay, I guess we don't have that one. So, yeah, whatever you want to say about them. We also have the not September, well, I keep doing that. I want to say like September 11th. The January 9th Commission has now subpoenaed, as of today, a whole bunch of people involved in the fake electoral scam, sending sending the fake delegates in order to either overturn the election or at least slow down the certification results. A whole bunch of people have been subpoenaed on that front. It looks like they're going to be taking that one seriously, and that's all of this shit's extraordinarily serious. But that one, I think, is going to. That's one of the ones that they've got that I think has some legs, because the that has no grounding in law, reality, or anything else. And what else did we say? And we're going to be talking about the debt today. So let's start with some of the lighter ones. Unless I missed anything, and I had up here just in case I wanted to reference some of these things, but I was looking for that shift video, and a lot of my stuff, I found it. Oh yeah, 3G is shutting down. That's an interesting one too, but I don't think that's, we'll cover that some other time. They're going to shut down 3G, and things that can't be upgraded are not going to have problems. There's always something. Yeah,
I have a geotab locator in my truck.
Mm-hmm.
So, if somebody were to try and steal my truck, we could track the truck down where it's at. So it's kind of like one of those anti-theft devices. So it's a geolocator, locates where my truck is, and it helps the office quite a lot knowing where I'm at. Sometimes if I can't call or they can't get a hold of me because maybe I'm in taking a shower or something. So they can locate me immediately where I'm at. Well, because everywhere that 5G has actually gotten up and is running, 3G has been shut down. So my device operates off the 3G and 4G networks. So if 3G isn't available at all, the device doesn't work at all. So now there's huge gaps all across the country where my truck just like falls into the Bermuda Triangle, and they have no idea exactly where I'm at. So yeah, they just gave me today the new tracker, the 5G tracker, so they can see me again.
Now they wouldn't have done that, but for the fact, I assume that's also the same system the government uses to track and make sure you're in compliance with the hours.
Kinda, sort of, not really. The government's got ELDs, and so that's hooked up to my truck. It has a geolocation in it. It runs off of the LTE system, and I had to upgrade that as well because the government said I had to update it because, again, 3G was going down. So they don't like having that gap on the electronic logging device. But no, this one isn't required by anybody. We do it, one, to lower insurance rates, because if the trucks are stolen, we can pinpoint the exact location of the truck. And the other one is just that it's incredibly useful for dispatch planning to know exactly where all of their trucks are. So if a customer calls up and says, "Hey, where's our load?" They can literally just pull up the website, log in, and say, "Okay, well, here's all of our trucks. We'll look for truck 8. Oh, there it is. He's right here." So it's really useful, but the device that we're using now, the GeoTabs locator, isn't required by anybody. It's something that we do voluntarily. But we already went through this with the electronic logging devices. We did that a couple of years ago. So,
all right. Well, let's start. Let's do this. So this is interesting. So the accounting firm that's been representing Trump personally, I think actually the whole Trump family, and the Trump organization has said they've sent a letter to the Trump organization's legal counsel, the chief legal officer for Trump organization, saying that or advising them that they should no longer rely on financial statements from June of 2011 to June 2020. So they're basically saying, we as your accountants are telling you that, and they went out of their way to not say that these statements are false. They went out of their way to not allege any crime, but they did say that you cannot rely on them, which is the sole purpose of making them, is to get data you can rely on. So these are worthless, is what they're saying. They don't want to say that, but that's what they're saying. And they're saying that you need to advise anybody interested in those documents, which would be business partners and or the IRS, that they're not reliable. You cannot, and they said explicitly actually that you cannot rely on them. So it's not just that they're unreliable. Maybe sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Just they are not. At this point, they are not vouching for the credibility of anything in any of those tax documents. That's a stunning statement for a law firm to be issuing. They appear to be saying that both for the Trump organization and for Trump's own accounts. And they've also said that they will no longer represent Donald Trump or the organization, citing, quote, non-waiverable conflict of interest. Now, there's only one of those that I'm aware of that this could possibly be. That would be the conflict of interest, if there's a conflict of interest between the organization and the client. So if the organization feels that the client is lying to them, there's a conflict of interest there that you can't get around. And if the client is about to get sued, and if the law firm is about to get sued, that's an unwaiverable. So I think the accounting firm, I think the accounting firm thinks they're going to get sued, and they're going to throw Trump under the bus. Trump is going to throw them under the bus, and there is a non-waiverable conflict of interest. So I think in anticipation of that, they've severed all relationships with Trump, and they've notified everybody that they do not stand behind any of those tax documents. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the company is obviously covering its ass because there's a lot of people going after Trump and investigating him for a lot of alleged misconduct. And this one's a little difficult because, as you had pointed out in a discussion we had earlier, if the company is actually innocent, this is the approach that they would take. If the company is complicit, in other words, they knew that some of this stuff was pretty shady, this is the approach that they would take. So just the approach itself can't really say anything, but I have a very hard time believing that with how diverse the Trump organization was, how complicated, just all of the things that they were in, that they didn't know a lot of what was going on and were at least complicit in quite a lot of shady stuff. I mean, you get into that kind of business and you're looking for a specific kind of professionals to kind of help you. So, this kind of goes to the core of businesses with integrity because, if they're talking about things as far back as 10 years ago. And it's like, well, if you had some questions about whether these were reliable, why didn't you say anything, 8 years ago or 6 years ago or 3 years ago? It isn't until people are actually investigating for crimes that you're like, oh, crap, we could get drug under with Trump, so we're now going to try and cover our ass and, as you said, throw Trump under the bus. So it's like I have a hard time believing that they weren't complicit in a lot of the shenanigans going on. And I have a feeling that these shenanigans are a lot more frequent in the upper echelons of income earners, even if they're not actually earning the income. They're ostensibly covering a very large amount of money being thrown around. So I want to see where it goes, and I think that you're right that they're both gonna try and throw each other under the bus. But it is pretty telling when they say, hey, the investigators are alleging these kinds of things and saying they have this kind of information, and that's counter to what we put in our tax documents. So we're going to have to say, crap, we maybe these aren't reliable. And of course, they're going to claim that they had no idea that they were being lied to. So it's kind of hard to tell.
I do want to clarify, though, their claim is stronger than that, and it's worth noting. Their claim is these are not reliable. Not the reliability is in doubt. They're saying we are advising you not to rely on these for anything. And I'll quote exactly. So we have come to the conclusion. Okay, so they said, quote, "We have come to this conclusion based in part upon the filings made by the New York Attorney General January 18th, 2022, our own investigation," which they apparently started after that, and information received from internal and external sources. While we have not concluded that the various financial statements as a whole contain material discrepancies, and I'm going to get into that because the lying that has already started about this is really, ugh. Based on the totality of circumstances, we believe our advice to you to no longer rely on those financial documents is appropriate. And they are advising the Trump Organization to inform any recipients of those statements, such as lenders, insurers, and or federal agents, not to rely on these statements. And that's not that they're unreliable. Those are two different things. One is saying they're unreliable means, look, you take a risk, well, they're unreliable. We don't know. Might work, might not. You might have it. I mean, if an airplane is unreliable, doesn't mean it won't take off. It just means it might not land. I mean, unreliable can mean so many things. What they're saying is they are issuing a positive instruction. Do not rely on these documents, meaning don't use them. Don't for anything. Don't use them to prop up your table. Do not rely on them. So that's a pretty bold statement. It's legal speak, which is why I may not seem. But I mean, they're not saying they're unreliable. They're saying do not rely on them. Those are two. One is sort of a description. The other one is an injunction. Don't do it. And they're doing that because they're probably legally required as soon as those documents are discovered to be inaccurate to advise them that they can't use them. So that's a pretty significant thing. Now, of course, what they said was, while we have not concluded that the various financial statements as a whole contain material discrepancies. If that were true, there'd be no reason to say this, but okay. But now the attorney for the Trump Organization came out and said, quote, let's see, we are disappointed that Mars has chosen to part ways. Their February 9th, 2022 letter confirms that after conducting a subsequent review of all prior statements of financial condition, Mars's work was performed in accordance with all applicable accounting standards. Well, that's what Mars is going to say. Of course, that's what they're going to say. And principles, and that such statements of financial condition do not contain any material discrepancies. That's not what they said. They said, we have not concluded that there are discrepancies. They don't know yet. They're saying they haven't reached a conclusion that there are. They're just saying you can't rely on it. And they're saying don't rely on it, actually. So it's just funny because they're taking this, it's essentially a form of negation reason. But what they're doing is they're taking a very simple statement. We have, it's sort of like when somebody says, okay, you haven't been proven guilty. Like, court said I was innocent. No, they said you hadn't been proven guilty. Innocent and not guilty are two different things. Anyways, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's definitely getting a lot more serious. So, one of the things I kind of a little torn on this. On the one hand, it's like, yeah, it's good to show people that progress is being made in a lot of these cases. Because if he did a lot of this stuff that is being alleged, then yeah, he should probably go to prison for that. But I sometimes, especially after all of the coverage of Trump, which during his presidency, which I really wish they would extend the same kind of scrutiny and dedication towards President Biden. They don't. I get worried about a little bit of fatigue. People are going to be like, oh my God, they're talking about freaking Trump and his crap again. It's like, just finish your investigations and let us know what you found. So I've talked to some people who are just sick of listening to all of this stuff against Trump, and it's like, and the fact that it's moving, fairly slowly because they want to get all their ducks in a row, and investigations like this do indeed take quite a lot of time. So I think that they're losing some people, with they keep speculating on things. But again, for some people, you want to know that there's some progress being made. Remind them, hey, we're still doing this, and don't forget about it. I don't think anybody's in danger of forgetting about it.
Well, and Trump is now going to be in court because he's now been added back to the list of defendants on the inauguration fraud investigation, which is going to trial. He has been added back to that list, so he is now, I think that's a criminal case, so he is now a defendant in a criminal case there. That's looking into misappropriation of funds from the inauguration committee for his I was going to say his first inauguration as if he had more than one, but that was I woke up and was relieved to find that wasn't the case. But anyways, so he's this is unbelievably serious, and he's his accounting firms are bailing on him, the lawyers are bailing on him, and he's just ending up in more and more cases. So far, they've been reasonably small, but I think that's going to change pretty quickly. All right, so
well, and they're building these small cases up to, as a foundation to go after some of the big stuff, because if they can, especially if they can win a lot of these smaller cases, when you start getting into some of these bigger cases where criminal charges may be coming at them, it's like they're building up an environment and they're building up a history of misconduct. So they'll be able to come back and say, well, look at all of these things that, this is showing a pattern of misconduct. So, they're trying to tear down all of his credibility as well. And that it takes a long time to do all of these things. So on the one hand, I'm glad that they're updating and, because I believe that that's what one of the things media is there to do. And I wish that they would just do that for everything, and not play any kind of favorites whatsoever. Whether I like the guy or whether I hate the guy, I want the media to be hard on them, and I want them to hold their feet to the fire. And on the other hand, you run the risk of, getting burned out on the topic. How many people are just like, I'm sick and tired of listening to this. Nothing serious is happening. It's, it's like how long it's been, a year and a half since the election, and it's like nothing serious. I mean, he's still wandering around playing golf or whatever it is that he's doing.
Well, right now.
Tweeting.
Well,
he's not. I guess he's not tweeting. They banned him.
No, he's not tweeting. He's not tweeting, which was probably a mistake. There was so much schadenfreude on my part when he lost his Twitter account. I was like, oh, that hurts. It's funny. I think he'd rather lose all his money than lose his Twitter account. That was his identity right there. So I was thrilled when he lost it, but then I was like, uh-oh, because now he's got to fill the void with something, and apparently it's sedition. Well, so and I just want to remind people, too, that the court filing from New York Attorney General's office has said that it found, quote, significant evidence indicating that the Trump organization used fraudulent or misleading asset valuations to obtain a host of economic benefits, including loans, insurance coverage, and tax deductions. We'll talk about some of those loans, too, because that gets back into Deutsche Bank, where what they're saying now is there's racketeering charges that are being prepped against them for the Deutsche Bank incident and possibly money laundering. So I think also, too, you're going to get the smaller ones first anyway, because they're easier to prepare, and the people with the bigger ones want to wait too, because it adds more pressure every time. I mean, right now imagine how he's feeling. I mean, he's just his accounting firm has just bailed on him, and they are highly incentivized to flip. They are highly incentivized to flip because they can't operate unless they can file with the federal government. And the federal government can pull their license just like that. So. I have to believe that he's in a shit ton of trouble just by that thing. It seems inconsequential, but if his accountants, and again, the phrase was non-waivable conflict of interest. Okay. The only one I can think of, if it can't be waived by anybody, it means they're expecting to be on the other side of each other in court. That's what that means. So, yeah, but I think you're right. Of
course, yeah. They're trying to save their ass. They got in bed with somebody who was doing a lot of shady shit, and I believe that they were probably aware of a lot of the shady shit and covering for him, and they're trying to save their asses. So, but it makes me wonder, you think, well, there's got to be a lot of pressure and stress on Trump over all of this stuff because he's getting hit from lots of different directions by lots of different things, and granted, they're relatively small at the moment, but, they definitely have the potential to build up into quite a big tsunami of stuff coming at him. And then I go, did you watch the last 4 years when he was president? You really think a narcissist of that caliber is even considering that he's in the wrong and is worried about any of this at all? I'm not entirely convinced he's even losing any sleep over any of this stuff, because I'll bet in his own little world, in his mind, he's the victim of all of this stuff, of fake news, and he's just being attacked. because they don't like the fact that he said that I was going to make America great again, and that we actually did all of this stuff. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced that he's losing sleep over it right now, but I could be wrong.
I think he's going to think he's in the right no matter what. I agree with that. But I think narcissists can feel a tremendous amount of stress when they feel like their image is being attacked, and if they feel like there's nothing they can do about it. I think that's also why you get narcissists who can explode into various forms of rage. It's when the obviousness of of their superiority is under assault quite considerably. And my suspicion is we're going to start to see Trump start to come unglued. And we've already seen some hints of that. He looks like he's got handlers who are kind of keeping him in line, but I think he's going to have issues with the top secret and classified documents at Mar-a-Lago that they just took out of there in plastic containers, so I could read half of them. The first half that they took out were in these plastic containers. I could see through the containers. It's all newspaper ads about newspapers where Trump's in the headlines. So I was like, really? That's what he's taking? Okay. But
so what they need to do is they need to give him a phone that has a fake Twitter on it, so he thinks that he's tweeting things, but it just goes into the void and nowhere. So he can be angrily tweeting away on his golden throne in his bathroom, and nobody's the wiser. I mean, that's got to be a terrible, terrible nightmare for somebody like Trump to think that they're tweeting into a void where they can't be heard.
Yep. Well, so all right. So he's going to be. I mean, Jason says he doesn't think Trump's ever going to see the inside of a jail cell. I hope it doesn't work out that way, and there's certainly precedent for that. But I think he's going to get hooked, and I think he's going to get hooked badly. And I think this is just sort of the start. I think we're going to see the floodgates, where it's just going to be a joke on a. What was Trump indicted for? This.
What wasn't he?
This hour. So that's my suspicion, and I think there's going to be a lot of things. He's the other thing is it looks like the January. So this segues actually into the January 6th committee, because they have now subpoenaed. Today they subpoenaed 6 people from the 6 of them. And I think they were all members of the illegitimate electors, including Michelle Roman, who we talked about. She was. Wait a minute. No, subpoenaed by the committee are. Michael Roman and Gary Michael Brown. Right. If I recall, if memory serves, these were the. Was it? I want to say Michigan. The ones in Michigan, including the head of the Republican Party in Michigan, who was pretending to be a fake elector, and said he basically got his orders from Giuliani, and it was implied, or at least understood, that Giuliani was getting his marching orders from Trump. Anyways, they've all been subpoenaed, as well as the chairwoman of the Arizona Republican Party, Laura Cox, former chairwoman of the Michigan GOP, all of whom were fake delegates, and Douglas Mastrantonio and Mark Finchman, who are Pennsylvania and Arizona state legislators. So, and they're saying the committee has written that there is credible evidence that both former Trump campaign officials. Wait a minute. Both. Okay, that would be Roman and Brown. Tried to appoint a slate of fake electors after the 2022 election in an attempt to either overturn or delay certification. So, and they're taking it seriously. Now, what happens if the Senate flips and goes to conservatives? You'd think. No, you wouldn't. I would hope that they say, well, we're doing this investigation and we let it wrap up, and they just try to speed it up. Now they'll shut it down, and they've said they'll shut it down. They've said it's unjust, it's immoral, and all these other things. So they'll shut it down. So this has to get done before the next Congress is sworn in. So that's where.
Yeah, and that one really pisses me off too, because it's like, especially when it comes to the fake electors, that needs to be on the news. You talk about worried about people getting burnout, but that's a story that needs to be everywhere, and people need to be reminded of it. Because you want a banana republic. This is how you get a banana republic. That is an unprecedented move. Kind of like him sending in federal troops to just abduct people off the streets of Portland for no apparent reason, with no recourse, with no information. It's like, there are things that you don't there are lines you don't cross, and that's one of them. And sending in fake electors to try and get yourself elected to president, that's a line you don't cross. And I think everybody should be in agreement with that. I don't care what your political standing is.
Well, and as we've had this discussion before, and this really can't be stressed enough, and this is extremely important to understand, because I think it causes problems, but this is actually one of the reasons they do it this way. The Constitution does not give a lot of guidelines about how elections are to be run. And that's deliberate. All the Constitution says is that the states will get electors, they can choose how to assign those electors, and the electors will do the Electoral College, and they will determine who's president, the Electoral College. But they're clear, the states can determine the electors any way they choose. And it's interesting because in some states there aren't even laws. In some states, it's the governor who selects them. The governor just says, I'm selecting them, boom. And the governor, by tradition and tradition only, it's not in the law, goes by either the popular vote or all winner take all. Most states have a law that says the governor or whoever, Secretary of State, whoever's appointing them, has to do it based on the vote in that state. But there's some states that they don't even have that in the law. The governor can just wake up tomorrow and say, you know what, I'm giving them all to Biden, just whatever. And they've never done that because they'd never be able to run for office again. But technically, there's nothing stopping them. But all that aside, the states can choose electors any way they want. Each state sets up its own election system. Each state does it differently. They're all reasonably similar. We would recognize it from one state to another. But the reason this is important is the federal government does not have the power to not seat your electors. They don't have the power to say that they are invalidating your electors as long as they are certified by your state. The federal government cannot stop your electors. That is deliberate. And Mike Pence knew that, which is why he reiterated that he would only accept state-certified electors and he would not deny any state-certified electors. He doesn't have the power to. In fact, he's explicitly prohibited from doing that. This is what they were asking him to do, and now they've got Ward, who apparently was one of the people contacting Pence and saying to Pence that he had to not accept the state electors, which he is not empowered to do, and nobody in government can. It's not even. Holy shit. So I'm sure you have something you want to say about that, but just real quick, $2. This is okay, I got this wrong last time. I'll try this time. CRB Vegas? Is that right? Am I right on that? I'll say I'm right.
Sounds good.
Nobody's contradicted me. Any concerns for the DNC if this doesn't pan out? Not quite sure what that means. This could go either way. I mean, the DNC is really worried more than this about redistricting. I think their concerns right now is redistricting and how these elections are done at the state level and how governors are elected at the state level. It was Rove who actually, and gerrymandering's been around for a while, but Rove figured out that if you go for sort of a long-term strategy, really try to get the governors, because if you get the governors in states, then in most states you have much more control over districting guidelines. Governors often have veto power over the districts and can certainly have some influence on how the districts are done. So if you get the governors, 2 to 6 years later, you have some serious impact on the House and Senate at the federal level. So Rove made this huge push to get basically every governor he could in the country red in an effort to. That's how he was going to capture the Senate. I mean, it was actually a brilliant plan. So that's what I think the DNC is most worried about now. If the country's so polarized, there are a lot of people who just want Trump off radar. Then they don't care if it's because he's in jail or he's sipping martinis at Mar-a-Lago, as long as they don't have to see him on the news, as long as they don't want to have to hear about him. I mean, it's like a really bad ex, right? It's like you're just sitting there going like Trump who? They want him gone. And if he's thrown in jail, there are a lot of people who aren't going to be happy about it, even people who don't support Trump, because they think this is a nightmare and they think, you know what, he's done, he's not taken seriously, that's punishment enough, let's move on. I don't think so, for any number of reasons that we've outlined before. But I think it's a lose-lose across the board. So the question is, how do conservatives deal with it? And they've got their own problems. So I don't think, and I could be wrong. I'd be curious to see somebody who knows a lot more about political science answer that question than me. But I don't think the outcome of this affects the DNC all that much. I think they're going to be affected much more by redistricting and any significant challenges to Roe v. Wade. If Roe v. Wade falls, that is the best way to keep the Senate. The Senate has a real shot of staying in Democratic hands if Roe v. Wade falls. And the reason is because that isn't going to get out the vote for the RNC much. They're going to be sitting there going like, hey, we won, but they'll still be pissed about whatever they're pissed about. But, oh shit, that'll mobilize Democrats in a way that has not happened in a very, very long time. So I think those are things that are going to have a greater outcome. Sinister Porpoise, $2. We need more unpresidential moves for Trump. Yeah, oh, dear Lord. Just when you think. I think I had one more in mind. I got one, but I want to hear from Ms. Zandring. But thank you both very much for that super chat, those super chats. We really appreciate it. Zandring, what were your thoughts? And then I had one more quote I wanted to give, but then, yeah. So tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that we need to pay attention to some of these things, not let them go, because, these are very dangerous lines to try and be crossing if you want to maintain a democratic republic.
It's amazing how easily we've accepted things that if we saw in another country would realize was a real fucking problem. Yeah. Okay, hold on a sec. Using their own logic, Harris can choose Florida and Arizona is problematic. Actually, that's really true. I like that. So Mowdy, Christopher Montgomery Christopher says, what was it? Auntie Modifer? I don't know. I'll have to work on that. Using their own logic, Harris can choose Florida and Arizona as problematic and throw that. Not only has he got a really good point there, but that's essentially what Texas tried to do, right? I mean, Texas sued saying, okay, I think it was Georgia can't seat there because we don't like how they ran their election. It's like, you've got no fucking standing. What on earth makes you think you've got this is, and it's actually really disappointing because there were some things I genuinely admired in the Republican Party and in conservatives, and it was an allegiance to certain values, and that allegiance is irrefutably gone. And there's a new guy running for governor who's going to try to make a stab at telling truth to power. Good luck with that. So, but this goes into Fox News just did Fox News has been repeatedly saying that. And let me just see if I can get the, here we go, that the Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, that, what's the number they're giving here? It's 16%. So what is it? 16% only. They've said, quote, and both Tucker Carlson and the Washington Examiner have reported on this, saying that, quote, a new poll shows that only 16% of Canadians would vote for Trudeau again as Prime Minister. Let's see. Fox News contributor Tammy Bruce made a similar claim on Monday. Only 16% want him back as Prime Minister. So that tells you where the people are and how they're viewing his actions. All of that's horse shit. You can get there if you lie. But so what they're quoting is and then let's see I want to see if I can find the poll they were citing was conducted by Maru Public Opinion. Didn't even ask if people would support Trudeau or if they wanted him back as Prime Minister. What the question was quote, and by the way, it's a confusing question. It's poorly worded. Quote, do you think Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has made you want to vote for him because of how he dealt with this situation? That's a really bad polling question. It's confusing, but the other thing is it doesn't tell you anything because what they're essentially asking, and depending on what the other questions were, maybe you could see why they did this. But I'd have to look at the whole poll to understand why they did something like this. But what they're basically saying is, did these actions make you want to vote? So let me rephrase that. Have you decided that you want to vote for him, and is it because of how he's dealt with this situation? That's the question. So you have to both say that you're going to vote for him, and it's because of this. 16% said that, which is actually reasonably good. What that means is there's 16% of people who like what he did so much that they weren't going to vote for him, and now that he's done this, they are going to. But that's all it means. That's, I think it was the same poll. No, it wasn't that same poll, but a series of 4 polls conducted from February 11th to the 13th have found that his approval rating is at a disapproval rating, is at about 48%, meaning almost half the country disapproves of him as prime minister and says that he's doing a bad job. That's not 16%. Fox is just either they don't, I don't know whether they're lying or they just, I can't think they're stupid enough to realize that's just not what the poll is asking, and you can't justify that. But they're going to go around with that. So that's going to get us into the truckers, the Freedom Convoy and what's going on there. So what are your thoughts on why don't you start us off on the Freedom Convoy and what you think?
I think that anytime that truckers think that they're going to protest in a way that shuts down trucking, so they're going to go, shut their trucks down, they need to be very careful about the causes that they choose to do, especially if they're going to use their truck, then continue to use their trucks to actually shut down things, like say parking in the middle of a city to shut down the center of the city. So not only are they not running, but they're blocking access. Yeah. Because those two things will piss off the general population pretty damn fast. Because, if you get the majority of trucking, especially in dry van and refrigerated freight sectors of the trucking industry, to actually shut down, you can cripple the country and you can cause enormous amounts of unrest because all of our food is delivered by dry van or refrigerated trucks. So if you can get the majority of them to shut down, you're going to cause widespread food shortages, and that gets really bad. I mean, when they actually get to a point where your stores don't have any food and the majority of people are going hungry, you want to talk about seeing violence and unrest start to really erupt, especially in cities first. That's a great way to do it. And then blocking, causing a nuisance and inconvenience for people. I mean, it's bad enough that when they're driving down the road and they're not allowed to go the same speed as cars, and they get mad because they're getting slowed down by trucks. Think of what you're going to do when you shut down an entire city, or at least the central part of the city. So you have to be very careful about the things that you're going to protest. So I'm not entirely sure that it's a great use of time, especially since this is Canada. It's kind of surprising that it's coming out of Canada. This would be something I would expect to see kind of going on in the United States somewhere. Thankfully, or perhaps not, depending upon your views on it, truckers are like cats. They're almost impossible to herd, and you can never get a consensus. So it makes something like shutting down the trucking industry nearly impossible to do, which is a good thing, because I don't think that shutting the trucks down in a country is a good idea. I think that backfires very quickly. And I'm torn on things like vaccine mandates. It's like, I'm not entirely sure. Canada's laws are different than the United States, so I'm not sure on the ability of Canada to be able to just institute a vaccine mandate. Maybe they can, maybe they can't, I don't know. But one of the things that's fairly well established is that countries do have the ability to impose requirements for entering the country, and one of those is vaccines. The United States explicitly has this power. I can't imagine that Canada wouldn't. And the protest started over the vaccine mandate in order to cross into Canada. So a lot of people, and of course it affects quite a few people. If you're not going to get vaccinated, well, you can theoretically come into the United States, because oddly the United States doesn't require vaccination to come into. But to go back into Canada, they do require it. And they won't, even if you're a member or a citizen of the country, they can still keep you out without being vaccinated. You have to get it all set up with CBC, the Canadian border, essentially the border patrol equivalent to the United States. So, they can stop you. And a lot of people are pissed off about that. And I'm actually surprised they got as many trucks. I mean, it's hard to get estimates on the actual number of trucks involved, but they're estimating somewhere between a couple thousand probably. And they're also blocking border crossings. And there's been some shenanigans cropping up at some of these border crossings. And the fact that, generally speaking, anytime you start shutting down access and blocking things with trucks, people just get mad. So I'm not sure that this was a really great idea, but apparently enough people felt strongly enough about it that they decided they wanted to go protest. And again, with it being in Canada, it's a little bit harder to opine. I mean, if this was happening in the United States, I would have a lot better ideas because, we have the Constitution. I know the Constitution fairly well.
I'll admit I've been asked by several people why hasn't In Time really covered this, and it is absolutely of the level that we would cover. We do give somewhat more preference to U.S. stories because most of our audience, and certainly all of the people who work in the nearest vicinity of In Time, are Americans. So there's going to be that bias, and that's where we lean towards, and that's what we also all understand better. But we do take a lot of interest in international stories that are of significance, and this is one of them. This has met the bar, and it met the bar about a week ago at least, for something that we should really cover and maybe even do an entire show on, or at least an overtime on. We haven't. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But the biggest reason is, I'm going to be honest, I can't wrap my head around any of it. And it's going to require a real deep dive to start to understand just what's going on there. As an American, I got to tell you, I really was not pleased with the invoking of the emergency. Actually, I think it's emergencies. I was looking at it. I think it's plural. I keep saying it's singular because it sounds correct singular, but it's Emergencies Power Act. At any rate, I was just sitting there going, this doesn't sound like this rises to the level. And when Justin Trudeau spoke about it, he spoke about, look, we have to use it because even though this gives him and the government broad powers over the entire country. Now, it has to be for a limited period of time, yada, yada. These things always are, of course, in theory. But he says it meets the minimum requirement, which is it affects more than one province. And it's the only way to deal with certain elements of this. Now, there were I really liked the questions he was getting asked. The people asking him the questions, I was sitting there going like, oh, wow, they're asking some really good questions. Like, well, wait a minute. If the local police can deal with this, what is it that you're giving them from these tools that they can't get anywhere else? And if they can't deal with it, what precisely are you going to do? You said you're not going to call in the military. You said that this isn't going to turn into a military operation. So what precisely are you going to do with this that isn't being done right now? Where's the disconnect? And there were some pretty hard questions. I was like, I kind of like the Canadian press. But so in my mind, I got a lot of questions, and all he kept talking about was how this wasn't neighborly. And I was just like, only Canada could invoke an emergency declaration because people aren't being neighborly. That was surprising, even for Canada. But as much as, from what I can tell, people in the U.S. think it's a bad idea and think he shouldn't have done it. And we actually have a poll. I'm going to go look at our poll because we did a poll on Twitter. That's our formal. Our formal sample is people who self-select for wanting to engage in toxic environments. But I do want to look at that in a minute. But from the people I've spoken with, and what I'm seeing here suggests that most Americans are sitting there going like, it's protesters, any number of ways to deal with it, but it's not a national emergency. However, according to the Angus Reid Institute survey, which was conducted between February 11th and February 13th, 69% of respondents said that they opposed the protesters themselves, their approach and behavior, versus only 27% who were supportive of the protesters. Also, 64% of respondents said that they opposed the protesters' demand to end all pandemic restrictions, and 72% said that the protesters have made their point and should, quote, go home now, while 22% said that they should stay in Ottawa and other protest sites until their demands are met. Those are some pretty strong numbers against. So 72% is not quite the top two boxes, but that's a lot of people saying they should go home in Canada, and it looks like a number of people. There's a lot of consensus that he has not handled this well, but it looks like, at a minimum, the protesters are not receiving wide support in Canada, and are everybody wants them to go home. Now, this is odd because I watched Fox News and they said that everybody in Canada is supporting the protesters. It looks like that might not have been entirely factually accurate. So, yeah, let's see. All right. So, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking it might, at least from a U.S. kind of standard, because again, the laws in Canada are a bit different. So you can't really use some of the principles of the United States. Like in the United States, this would be protected speech. So, trying to issue an emergency declaration against them, wouldn't really hold up. But in Canada, it could possibly. I don't think that the government, the federal government there up in Canada has responded very well to this. They've really been dismissive, critical, calling them fringe, again, unneighborly, not really supporting of Canadian values. I mean, they're really, Justin Trudeau has really othered all of the people supporting this, and there was a lot more support than I originally thought would pop up for this. And I think that the media, at least the supportive media of them, has given the impression that there's a lot more involved than actually are. But they are causing a nuisance, and they're definitely being heard, at least by most people. And of course, you have some issues, like at the Coots border crossing. They ended up arresting some people and confiscating a load of weapons that was coming down to the border. So yeah, there's been some concerning things, and it can be difficult because it's like, okay, well, you can get some pretty wacko extremists that can agree with something that is you might find eminently reasonable, and so suddenly you find that you're being supported by these wackos, and these wackos start going out and doing some pretty wacky stuff, and you're like, wait a minute, no, we don't support that. Well, yeah, you're going to get tarnished with that brush as well, because, oh, look, some crazy person just brought up the entire truckload of weapons and body armor down to the Coots border crossing, and thank God they caught that, because who knows what would have happened. And you're like, wait a minute, of course, the people kind of in charge of I hate to say in charge, kind of coordinating the Coots border crossing blockade. I hate to call it a blockade, but obstruction. Let's call it an obstruction. Of course, disavowed that, saying, "Oh, no, that's not what we're here about at all." But of course, you're starting to see quite a few crazies come out as well, and it's a difficult situation, and all over requiring a vaccine to cross an international border, which I personally don't find to be a particularly onerous requirement.
Well, and so. That does bring up, because I want to go back for a second to something that you had said earlier, because I think this is one of the things that Trudeau said was he was doing this because once he had done this, he's legally allowed to order certain industries to operate even against their will. An example would be tow trucks. So he said once this authorization went into effect, he could go to a towing company and say, you will tow these vehicles. And even if they say, no, I support them, it's like, you're going to jail if you don't tow them. So this gives him legal enforcement even over civilian companies to act on behalf of the government. That is obviously something that you can do in the U.S., but there's a lot of steps from here to there, and basically can only be done at the presidential level. If he basically, what is it? I think he can. What is it? It's I was going to say nationalize. It's not nationalized, but it's when he can basically actually draft you if he wants, I think. But all that notwithstanding, you had suggested, okay, so I think the importance of the trucking industry in this country is greatly underappreciated, because obviously, we go to Whole Foods, we go to Costco, we go wherever we go, and we're used to everything always being there. And it's funny because I was just sort of thinking about how I process this myself. I was like, how does it get there? Oh, well, like Amazon brings it, I guess, or somebody just, it's trucks. It doesn't they don't 3D print it there. The only way any of this stuff gets there is by trucks. That's the only way that I'm aware of that grocery stores maintain their stocks. It's the only way. So when you take a look at everything in your life that's dependent on the trucking industry, it's a shit ton that we don't think about, and it's well more than just Amazon. It's every major restaurant, every major grocery store. So the question is, does this give them more power if and when they decide to protest and or to stop working? Should they be empowered to be able to do that? And if so, should there be any limitations, given the fact that if every secretary stops working for 3 weeks, and this isn't a dig on secretaries, a lot of shit's going to go to hell in a handbasket. Most corporations would barely be able to function, but we're not going to see a complete collapse of the country. If every single trucker in the U.S. stopped working, it seems to me, based on my understanding, that we're looking at kind of an apocalyptic scenario, because I don't know where we're going to get our food from. Cities are great because they have a lot of technology. They have a lot of things that people want. One thing they don't have is food. There aren't farms in cities. Their food has to be brought in. It has to be brought in 24/7. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the trucking industry, it would take 7 days. The trucking industry could collapse essentially all of North America in 7 days. If every truck simply shut down for 7 days and refused to do anything, it would cause a cascade that would eventually cause the collapse of the country. Because trying to come back after that, especially with kind of some of the logistic shortages, the logistic restrictions that we have going on right now, add on top of that, you just shut down every truck in, say, the United States, especially the United States. But it would end up shutting down Canada too, because Canada is our number one trading partner. So it would only take 7 days, and you would end up with a cascade. And even if the trucks started to try rolling again, perishable foods are just that. They're perishable, and many of them need to be transported in a certain amount of time, and you're just going to lose those things because they weren't transported quickly enough. You have frozen and dry goods that are going to get so backed up, that trying to clear out a distribution center after a shutdown like that is going to be a nightmare. Things aren't going to be rolling. Things aren't going to be, it just caused a cascading failure. And trucking isn't the only, industry out there that could do this to the country. There's several other pretty critical, if all, say, warehouse workers decided to go on strike, you would end up with the same thing because none of the trucks would move. It's like, how are you going to distribute anything if all the warehouses just stop working? Because they won't be able to load the trucks to get the goods where they need to go. So yeah, you have to be careful. Now, there's never been anywhere close to any kind of movement that's threatened this in any way, shape, or form. I think the Canadian convoy that's going on now is probably one of the largest that's ever happened in North America. So, I hear people talking about trying to get U.S. trucks together. There's been shutdown D.C. attempts several times, and you usually end up with a couple dozen at most trucks that get involved with that. So it's very difficult. And again, because the industry is so diverse, there are so many different parts of it with so many different interests, that it's really difficult to get all of the trucks to agree, or trucking companies and truckers themselves to agree to any kind of action. And of course, people need to be able to eat. And it's like, I can't just go sit someplace and protest because it's like I have bills to pay. So, you're going to have lots of that. And the fact that, if a significant number of trucks actually were to do that, the amount of money that I could make from the shortage of trucks to haul goods, the cost of transportation would shoot through the roof. It's simple supply and demand. People need their goods moved, and they're going to start paying exorbitant amounts of money to do it. So it's pretty dangerous in theory, what truckers could do to the country. It's actually catastrophic what they could do to the country. But I don't think in any realistic way could it ever actually happen. And I don't believe that they have any real contingencies for something like this, because there's never been anything close to concerning when it comes to truckers trying to shut the country down. I mean, but we like to pat ourselves on the back and say, how important we are, because hey, we could literally cripple the country in 7 days. But and you see that all the time.
And I forgot too, of course, gasoline, right? Because that comes in on trucks, right? So, I mean, if the truckers that are providing but I think you bring up an interesting point too, which is, of course, very quickly, the amount of money that you would have to pay truckers who'd be willing to cross the picket line, as it were, would go up dramatically, but it would go up, and there would be people who would be sitting there going, yeah, I'll do it. And so that does make a lot of sense for it, but it's that's an interesting contingency. And we already have supply line problems. And the suggestion that I've heard, at least, is that while it's a small, the number of protesters that we have right now that are the truckers protesting, while that represents a reasonably small portion of the total truckers that are operating, given that there's already supply line problems, it's enough that it's measurable, the impact that they're having on making the supply chain worse. Now, this is not to suggest that either they don't have the right to protest or that they're horrible people for this. Believe it or not, I think you have to bifurcate those questions, because they're still human beings. They still have a right to protest, but it gets tricky because you are talking, and this is one of the reasons why Trudeau did bring in this act, was to be able to force some people in critical industries to continue working even against their will. But it looks like we actually have some. Thank you. It looks like we already have some demonstrable. I don't know if anybody could notice it. I don't know if anybody's noticing that there's one fewer, Charmin at the store, but it apparently is affecting the supply chain already.
Yeah, you have auto parts are having some issues, and you've got some plants that are shutting down for a day because they couldn't get stuff across the Ambassador Bridge. And so, yeah, I mean, it does have an effect. I mean, there's already a logistic shortfall when it comes to trucking. We're already understaffed as far as trucking goes. So, any kind of disruption of any significance is going to be felt. One of the Blazing Wizard Pope mentions, and that's why you have a nationalized railroad grid as the main supply line. And in the United States, that is not a possibility. They do not have anywhere near the kind of infrastructure that would be needed to run things, to actually. But as far as trying to run, say, the food,
I'm gonna cut you off one more time. So, sorry. All right. So here's what happened, folks. Sorry. Thank you, Titan. So here's what happened. I damaged my mouse, and it keeps left-clicking, right-clicking. Titan was good, sent me some video, which I want to show, and I was trying to bring that into the interface, and the mouse double-clicked and I don't know what the hell it was doing, but it screwed up the interface as I was porting that in, and it suddenly switched us to the credits. I got us back, but it's not really designed to just go straight back from the credits, so we ended up muted. So...
lovely.
Yeah, so we are now unmuted, but that was because it kills our mics as soon as it goes to credits, and it's never been taught to, like, hey, if you bail on the credits, bring the mics back. That might not be a bad idea. Anyways, so you were talking about the infrastructure. So we don't have a nationalized system. We don't have a nationalized railway system, and when you are loading up the you can't just you really just can't send trains that are half empty, because it's really it's difficult it's already expensive as it is. You want to make sure they're full. Other than transporting containers to and fro for specific reasons, you don't send empty trains. So I think that was where you left off.
Yeah, and so you still need the trucks to move from distribution hubs. So you can't send trains everywhere, and it can take a week to get to load up a full train, to send it, like, say, from a port, and you're going to go all the way out across the country to deliver this stuff, and it's got to stop how many places to drop containers of stuff off, bulk foods. It takes a while. You can't, in today's system, the way that we've got things set up, it is not feasible to try and use the rail system. Even if you were willing to spend the probably trillions of dollars needed in upgrading and additional rail infrastructure, it isn't feasible. It's like they wouldn't spend the money on that. They would literally just accelerate the self-driving trucks technology, and they would probably fast track that instead of trying to screw with the trains. I mean, trains serve important purposes, and they can haul a lot of freight. I mean, if you fill the train up and send it across the country, it's actually more efficient than trying to send things on a truck. But a truck can go across the country in 72 hours, 72 hours. You can go from one end of the country to the other. So a train can't do that. So train infrastructure is not viable going forward. Like I said, they would put the money into self-driving trucks, which there's a lot of money in that industry already, and I think we'll eventually probably get there because there's a huge economic motivation for doing so.
Well, and didn't the first, didn't a self-driving truck now just sort of break a record for being able to I don't, and of course they're not going to be stuck with the limitations that you are in terms of sleep and all that other stuff. Did I read that just recently?
Possibly. I haven't been paying too close attention to the all of the different things that the self-driving technology has done. I know they've sent out self-driven trucks with people in them and to take over if there's a problem. But they are out there on the road. They're in testing. They are all actually hauling freight with self-driving trucks. But it's the way that I see it going down is it's going to start off with the technology. They're still going to require somebody in the cab that is capable of taking over until the technology is more or less proven to the public, not proven statistically, but has gained enough confidence among the public that the public doesn't freak out when they see, semis hauling 80,000 pounds down the road with nobody in them. And once that happens, it will be implemented in what's called line haul industry first, and that's people that are driving between distribution hubs. So they're going from one distribution warehouse straight to the next distribution warehouse, and they just transfer back and forth. It's a regional type of job. It's a very simple job. They drive the same routes all of the time. So that's the industry that would the sector of the industry that would first probably get taken over by self-driving trucks. So until I actually start seeing widespread usage of self-driving technology in the line haul industry, I'm not particularly worried. And the fact the industry that I'm in theoretically could be taken over by self-driving technology, but it would be one of the last industries because I do a lot of specialized stuff. So you kind of want a person there to manage all of that stuff. So once I start seeing all of it, 5 years ago they said it was 5 years away, and it's still not going on. But there is some good economic pressure and advantages to trying to eliminate drivers from commercial freight hauling.
And I just realized, actually, I think I wanted to say there was also something about a plane making a record, and it was a fully automated plane, but I think that was different. Well, all right. So what I want to do right now is, and Titan sent me this, so thank you. This is footage from right off of Twitter here, and let me just make sure that the sound is going to go to the right spot, because I think it still it doesn't default to the right. Yeah, and I'm sitting there going like, I knew the mouse was damaged, but I really love using it. This is like it's a Logitech G502. It's just a great, you can tell it's been like worn to death. I've had that thing for years, and it just fell, and it's got weights in it, which you can adjust. It's like a pro gamer mouse. You can pull out the weights, and I never bothered to pull out the weights, but that means it is really heavy, and when it falls, ooh, yeah. So, but I kept it because I was like, well, you can still point with it. Just remember to not click anything. And then I'm in the middle of a show. And I was just like, oh, okay. So, yeah, that may not have been a good idea. So let me just make sure the audio on this is going to come out to the right spot. And, yeah, there, you might not be able to hear it. So let me move it to, I think you'll be able to hear it if I put it there. So let's see what happens. Yeah, I'll try putting it there. And then this is, so let me find the original tweet here. This was a man by the name of Paul Champ from Paul Champ Law, and says, quote, this is a peaceful protest. Well, what if you lived here and this was going on from the early morning until late at night? How would you feel? And this is from Ottawa. Let's check it out. Let's just about enough of that. We'll play. There was still 15 seconds left. We'll play the beginning again, and I'll turn on the gain control. That'll adjust it to the same level as our mics and everything. So I take it you heard that?
I did hear that.
Yeah. All right. So let's.
Of course, I can imagine exactly what it sounds like, regardless, because I know what a whole bunch of trucks blowing their horns sounds like.
But that's, I mean, if that's going on for, yeah, I got to admit that's. Okay, I'm starting to think maybe this is a national emergency. All right, we're gonna do this again. I'm not gonna play the full minute of it. We get the point. And you can see they're not moving, so they blocked up 2 lanes of traffic there, which is also going to block emergency access. And yeah,
Yeah, that's why I pointed out that you have to be very, very careful about what kinds of protests you're going to get involved with, as far as if you're going to try and get a large number of trucks, because public opinion and public sentiment will backfire against you really, really fast. You know, you can cause quite a lot of damage, quite a lot of inconvenience, and that's the fastest way to piss people off and alienate them from your cause. So you have to be very careful about what you decide to try and protest when it comes to trucking.
All right. Well, so we'll all right. Well, yeah. So, like I said, I mean, it's a little difficult for me to that clip's actually very helpful, because now it's like, okay, now at least I understand why they're as pissed about this as they are. I mean, to evoke national emergency powers was a little startling. And again, his justification, it was interesting. I saw about 45 minutes of his public address. And he was really like, you know, we try to be very neighborly here in Canada. It's all about being neighborly, and these people aren't being neighborly. So I'm invoking the Emergency Powers Act. And I was just like, really? So I wonder if that's in the Constitution or in the writing. Like you can. I want to know what the bar is for declaring war. You know, like, you know, apologizing less than 3 times a day. I don't know what it is, but I just, oh, all right, we should have.
Yeah, like I said, it's
yeah.
it's surprising that this is going on in Canada. I mean, you would think that this is something that you'd read about going on in the United States, not in Canada.
Do we know how many of them are Americans? Because I know at least I know a decent number are Americans, and that's one of the reasons they're protesting. And I know some are Canadian too, and they're and that was the big deal about the othering. Oh, I do want you to bring up the othering because you had mentioned that to me, and I think that was worth discussing. But do we know what percentage are Americans? And I wanted to say, and I was saying this like this, and Randolph just joined us, and I was literally in the process of saying it was Randolph who had made a comment. Now I've forgotten where I was on that, but we definitely need to have him on to discuss this. But that's, I think, its own show. So, but he's here, and he agreed to come on and chat with us about it. I just figured tonight, since we're going to be hitting so many topics, rather than set up having a guest come on, we'll just hit it and move on. But we'll definitely have to discuss that anyway. So the two questions here. First, I did want to discuss the othering that you had mentioned, but there was something else that we were talking about, and I spaced it.
As far as the convoy here?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. What percentage are Americans versus Canadian? Because I think that has and that's how I got to the othering, because saying that they're not Canadian was that was not cool. That was not cool. But
yeah, there are definitely some. I mean, it's like you can go through and watch some of the videos of people walking around. You'll definitely see some American trucks up there as well. So it's not just Canadians that are doing the blockade. There's a lot of people in the United States, and a lot of the truckers, and some of the far more right-wing media are all in great support, saying, "Yeah, great, stand up for your rights," and all of them. And I'm like, "Yeah, that's great. Stand up for your rights if you want to, but don't use your trucks to do this. This is really bad."
So Randolph is, this is, yeah. So maybe what we can do too is we have overtime tomorrow, and we're doing a bit of a new format, which I like, but I think we can also just maybe bring Randolph in for overtime. So Randolph and I will discuss it and figure out when's a good time, but I'd like to bring him in because he's seeing this firsthand, and so we'll bring him in to discuss it. All right. So, but before we go on this, you brought up an interesting point I hadn't really considered. In fact, that I just sort of heard and dismissed, and I thought you brought an interesting point. That was the othering that Trudeau did. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't like the way that he really handled this at all. I mean, when they started showing up, he took off, gave a couple excuses why he had to leave. It seems like they're not particularly interested in actually sitting down with the truckers, the organizers, or any of that kind of stuff. And the fact that they're calling them, "Hey, you're not real Canadians. This is just a fringe group," and it's like, well, you want to find a really quick way to piss off and galvanize the protesters. Start disparaging them and dismissing them. I don't think that's a good approach. And just politically, from an optics viewpoint, I don't think it's a particularly great approach either.
Hillary Clinton would disagree with you, but
clearly, and because she was and she made our first woman president as well, didn't she?
Touche. All right, so you're saying.
So I don't like the way that this was done. I mean, even if you don't agree with it and say, like, look, this is this is an eminently reasonable policy. This isn't a good thing for you to be protesting against. It's significant enough that you shouldn't just ignore it. Come in, spend an hour and sit down and talk to them, find out what they want, have a press conference, say, "Yeah, we sat down with the organizers, we did this. I don't think that this is a good policy." And it's like, I think that the policy that we have is eminently reasonable. And, so we're kind of at an impasse here, and then you've at least taken the steps to say, "Hey, okay, you're protesting something that we're doing. We've listened to your concerns, and we don't find a lot of merit to your concerns, or you've dismissed a lot of other counter concerns that need to be taken a look at as well. But we've made the attempt, and we've tried to come to some sort of resolution, and now it looks like you're the one that's being reasonable, and of course the protesters being unreasonable." And it's eventually going to get to the point where the protesters are going to look unreasonable the longer this goes on, because the more inconveniences people, the more this is going to backfire in public opinion. So, I was disappointed in the response of the Canadian federal government. But of course, I've only tangentially been paying attention to it because I have a life and a job, and it's like I can't afford to just go park my truck in Canada for a week and twiddle my thumbs. I mean, I'd much rather spend that with my wife. She's much more amazing than the city center of Toronto.
Well, you said that with Randolph
or Ottawa.
So I said there. Well, she's going to have to be pretty amazing then, because he's a proud Canadian. All right. Well, no, that makes a lot of. Well, it's this is a much more complicated issue than it. Yeah, I mean, it's. I don't know how and where they're getting the time for this, and again, because of their unique position in the supply chain, which is already stressed. Because of COVID, by the way, which is what we're trying to fix. That's I'm also. It seems to me that there has to be something more to this, and I think it's been suggested that there is. I don't know what, but it wouldn't surprise me if this was started on the American side by a U.S. element, and then if so, the question is, okay, are we looking at the elements of the far right that has been stirring up trouble along these lines, and what's next? Now, we do know, and Titan pointed this out, they had their they were using GoFundMe. GoFundMe suspended millions of dollars in donations. They switched to an organization that left their Amazon. It was Amazon Glacier S3 drive open. Now, you can't leave those open by accident. An administrator has to turn it off. So there's a lot of questions as to how that happened, but nonetheless, and Titan said they were hacked. They weren't even hacked. It was just that it was left open. And that's like saying somebody broke into a bank when the door was unlocked and the vault was left open. I mean, this it's a new company. It's a Massachusetts-based company. And passports, photos, home addresses of everybody who donated was left exposed. Nobody knows, to the best of my knowledge, how many people got it. Or what they got, because it's also that defense that's they talk about, like, okay, instead of having security at the bank, we'll just pretend there's security at the bank, and since nobody knows there isn't security at the bank, everyone will assume it's secure, and nobody will actually try to open the door and try to break in. If somebody knows that something if nobody knows that something is completely unsecure, it acts as if it's secure, at least for a short period of time, until people start figuring it out. But obviously that's, oh, dear Lord. All right. So,
yeah, and that was in the Give, Send, Go.
That was it. Yes. Thank you.
Donation.
Yep. That was the name. I'd forgotten the name. All right. So, and then the last thing, and this is something that's kind of off topic, although I did want to say too, because it was just a report that came out. They're saying now that the sea level rise is increasing, and they are anticipating over the next 30 years a 10 to 12 inch rise in sea level. So that's, they're saying by 2050, between 10 and 12 inches rise in sea level, which doesn't sound like a lot. It's a lot, because we're already closer to the ocean than we should be. We do that because beachfront property is very valuable. You can sell it for a lot of money, so we move in much closer than we really should. These are vulnerable areas, and then when you get into storm surges, this is that just came out today. But I think we'll save that. This isn't overtime. We're not here to just beat everybody to death with the news. For that pleasure, join us on Overtime on Wednesdays at 9 p.m., where you will be bludgeoned to death with what's going on in the world. But having gotten that aside, because I thought that was at least just worth mentioning, you and I have been talking about, and we've talked about this before, oh, that's interesting. Okay. We had talked about economic policy. We've discussed economic policy on this show before. It's something I'm interested in for a number of reasons. That was monetary policy wasn't specifically the topic of The Water Thief, but it was essentially the whole point of The Water Thief was a rebuttal to neoliberal economic views, and it's the extreme neoliberal. It's the idea that government should have absolutely no role in regulating companies and that they really can self-regulate, which we seem to, I mean, what happened in 2008 seems to suggest that that's not true, because they did not act in their own long-term self-interest. They acted in their own short-term self-interest, but a lot of people sold out the long-term interests of the companies to make a lot of money. And they're like, even it wasn't Bernanke, and it wasn't Paulson, it was Greenspan who said, well, gee, according to neoliberal economics, that shouldn't be possible. It's like, okay, so, but at any rate, you and I have been talking, and you had brought this up, and I thought this was really interesting. And this gets into moral hazard, which I will define moral hazard in just 1 minute for people who don't know what it is. I think most of our audience probably does, but I'll define it in a sec. Moral hazard, which is a legit problem that I think is not often well understood or accounted for, and where the U.S. is in terms of its debt. We've spent a tremendous amount of money fighting COVID. It's hard to see what that went into. That may just be because you only see the failures and not the successes. Maybe if they hadn't put that money in, we'd all be Planet of the Apes right now. I don't know, but we'll get into that. But first of all, what is moral hazard? Moral hazard was discovered by insurance companies, and that's an insurance term, when they figured out a whole bunch of things like, cars that are insured, owners are less likely to lock their cars if the car is insured. And I've had people sort of straw man this and say, oh, well, I'd lock my car whether it was insured or not. Well, good for you. But the point is sort of the Overton window on locking cars, the range at which, whether or not you're going to lock a car. Locking your car is a bit of a pain in the neck sometimes, especially if you forget you're walking, or listen, you're just going to be gone for 10 seconds, right? So you're going to lock your car or not. And we all make that decision and that calculation as we're getting out. And that calculation is based on a whole number of factors, like how much of a pain in the neck it is, how long we're going to be, what kind of neighborhood we're in, so on and so forth. And then you reach a conclusion based on all those factors. Turns out whether you're not insured or not is at least subconsciously one of the factors you calculate. And if you're not insured, if any damage done to your car isn't going to be paid back to you, you are more likely to lock your car. That will weigh more on the calculation, which makes sense. That's not unreasonable. But they call that moral hazard because what they're saying, what moral hazard essentially is the concept that divorcing somebody from the consequences of their action makes them act more recklessly. You need to face the consequences for your actions, or else you will act more recklessly. We see this time and time again. We've seen loads of examples of it. That's why people say Trump needs to face the consequences of his actions. We moral hazard left and right. But that's essentially the concept of moral hazard. And it went from insurance, which is where it was first used, saying that the more people are insured, the dumber they'll act, which is just true. I mean, it's just a scale. But all that notwithstanding, it went on to economics, where they realized it's actually not an insurance problem, it's an economic problem. And it applies, the reason it applies to insurance is because it's an economic problem there too. And people who are gambling with other people's money, whether it's as a lawyer, whether it's as an investment banker, whether it's as an insurer or as the insured, when you're gambling with other people's money, you are much more liberal and much more likely to take risks than you are with your own money. So that's moral hazard. So having explained that, and assuming, as Andrew, you like that explanation, we had been talking about the debt, why it's so big, what to do about it, and the problem of moral hazard. So why don't you go from there, assuming you like my definition of moral hazard?
No, I think your definition works well, and it covers it very well. And the real crux of the situation is anytime you divorce people from the consequences of their actions, they tend not to learn from mistakes, and
yes.
It's a very difficult thing, especially when you're dealing in economics and kind of at a societal level. Because we'll take just a quick example in the banking industry. The government issues FDIC insurance, which covers people, I believe it's up to $300,000 in deposits now. So people don't, generally speaking, the average person in the United States doesn't have more than $300,000 in a bank. So the money that you put in your bank is pretty much completely covered. There's some exceptions. So people aren't particularly worried about what their bank is doing with the money, because even if they make a stupid mistake and the bank completely goes under, they're going to get their money back. And of course, that means that people aren't really paying attention to what their banks are doing. It's like I argue that we probably wouldn't have like a Bear Stearns or JP Morgan Chase style banks today if FDI insurance had never been instituted. because you would be.
Let me clarify real quick. So, what would still have them in terms of the investment side, but they would not be. They would be banks. They'd be investment banks, meaning they would take really rich people's money and gamble with that as is sort of expected. But it's the merging of that and the what's it called? I forget the other side, but the basic common everyday banking where, yeah, I actually have a regular checking account at Wells Fargo kind of thing. Is that
correct?
Yes. Okay. Perfect.
Correct. You're what people consider a bank, what the average person would call a bank. When you start getting things like Bear Stearns, it starts getting into lots of speculative investment type, monetary vehicles. We don't really consider those banks. When I say I'm going down to the bank, everybody kind of knows what I mean. And so the generalized banks that hold deposits, issues loans based off of those deposits. Fractional reserve banking is another issue involved in this. But if the bank fails, you're covered by the insurance. So nobody really pays attention to what their banks are doing. They just care about what kind of perks they get, whether it costs them money to have a checking account or not. Do you have overdraft? Those are the kinds of things, convenience things that people care about. Well, if the bank that you put your money into decides that it's going to get involved in kind of the same things that Bear Stearns is doing and gets into very risky monetary assets trying to make a short-term profit, and they end up failing, which is kind of more or less what happened in 2008, and they fail, and there isn't any insurance, you just lost all your money. And the threat of losing all of that money means that you're going to pay a little bit more attention, and you're probably going to want to put your bank into something like a local credit union. It's like where the board that is managing the investments that the deposits are put into. What kind of qualifications that they're requiring for loans. It's like you'd be a little bit more cognizant of what your bank is doing, and I believe that the majority of people would probably want to stick closer to a more local style bank where they have confidence in what the bank is doing with their money. Because if they screw it up and lose it, you're gone.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. So, and it cuts both ways on that one too, right? Because most of those banks, like so it's a commercial banking. It's a commercial. Wow, I must be more tired than I thought. It's investment banking versus I think it's commercial banking. So commercial banking is normally what we think of. Investment banking is a completely different thing, and they were allowed, I think in the 2000s to merge. But the investment banks still got the FDIC, which was a huge problem. So you as the consumer don't worry what they're doing with your money because your money is insured. So if they go bankrupt, you get at least up to that insured amount back, which covers 90% of Americans easily. So you're not worried about it. So there's the moral hazard on that front. There's the customers are not checking the banks because there's no loss to the customer other than a minor inconvenience until the government fixes it. So there's no oversight from the customer. The banks then can do all sorts of crazy things, but the banks, in terms of on the investment side, they actually, in most cases, and they started applying leverage, and that really screwed with the dynamics. But in most cases, they don't actually suffer if their clients suffer because they're gambling with their clients' money. They get paid on fees. They'll get a bonus if the fund that they're managing does well, but they get paid fees nonetheless. So especially when the CDOs were a huge fee-based business, and banks could sell just millions of these things and get paid in fees regardless of what happened with the CDO. So now there's no downside to them for them to gamble because it's somebody else's money, and if they lose it, well, sorry, it's the stock market. It's unpredictable. We did our best. So now there's nobody on either side that cares about what happens with the money.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, it's led, and it's supposed to be kind of a quick little example of kind of how this compassion can end up maybe leading astray and how it can be difficult because people get hurt. So not having FDIC insurance means that there would have been banks that went bankrupt and people would have lost their life savings. And those people, that can be devastating. And you don't want to sit around and say, it's like, look, we're compassionate people. We care about. It's like they didn't really do anything wrong. It's not like they're the ones that invested in these risky assets that failed and caused the bank to go bankrupt. And now everybody who had deposits in that bank have literally just lost everything that they had in the bank. It's not really kind of their fault, but, people get hurt. And we want to try and stop that. So it seems like a good idea to have insurance so that you can at least be secure and that you're not going to lose your life savings because a bank made a stupid decision. And that seems on the surface to be a good idea. But there is a moral hazard involved in that people don't generally recognize because, again, you're not facing the consequences of not paying attention to what your bank is doing. So it's just kind of a small aspect of it. And there's good arguments, I think, on both sides for this. And I'm not entirely convinced that FDIC insurance was a bad thing, because it can really devastate lots of people. But I do think that it would have really tamped down on a lot of the mergers going on. I don't think we would have a lot of these mega banks that are tied together, so that if J.P. Morgan Chase, loses its butt on its speculative assets, the general public that's just banking at your general bank down the store aren't going to be affected because those would probably be divorced. But where this really comes in, as far as economics, is when it comes to governmental spending.
Mm-hmm.
I'm when it comes to the federal government, this is where I'm very conservative. I want a limited government. I don't want the federal government doing a whole lot. I want it only doing the things that the states either can't or shouldn't be doing on their own. And then I think you should let the states figure out how they're going to deal with all the other problems that they have, or solutions that they need to come up with. And one of the reasons is because the federal government runs the printing press. The federal government is, at least today, kind of cooperating with the central bank. And they're doing a lot of things. And they're doing it for control and power, which is true. I mean, that tends to devolve when you get organizations of power. You tend to attract people who are attracted to power. They tend to form corruption. These are tendencies. They don't always happen. But the other issue is that they want your vote. And so they have the ability to borrow money. They have the ability to print money. And you're going to hear a conservative advocate for something that conservatives don't generally advocate for.
Only on in the government time, but yes.
Yeah. Taxes should be raised.
Right.
And not just, it's not just a tax the wealthy, because the wealthy don't make enough money to offset what the government is currently spending. And this is where the moral hazard comes in, because who can be against, welfare programs for the poor, military spending for defense budget, or for, overseas interventions, any host of things that the government actually spends money on, disaster relief, all of these things, many of them, you're like, hey, this is really good and we should have this. The WIC program, who could be against the WIC program? Well, the problem is that none of that stuff is actually funded. So they pass a new government program, and generally taxes don't go up when that program goes into effect. And if you get a Republican in office, taxes might actually be reduced.
Yeah, that's how they pay for it.
So
actually, is that they're going to, they sit there and say, we'll pay for it because we're going to increase taxes when GDP goes up by lowering taxes. We'll increase tax revenue by lowering taxes and increasing the GDP, which is interesting. Which
can happen. There is a diminishing returns for raising taxes, but when you look at the fact that the official U.S. debt has now gone over $30 trillion. And you think that we went up an entire $1 trillion in debt in a week, so the curve on the acceleration of the debt is getting quite a bit larger. There is a huge amount of unfunded liabilities as well. So my advocacy is to avoid the moral hazard of the government trying to do absolutely everything, and our tendency to now turn to the federal government to solve all of our problems, because you don't want to fight 50 battles in 50 states. You'd rather fight one battle at the federal level and then get it passed federally, and now it applies to all of the 50 states. I kind of understand why people would want to jump straight to the federal level and have their legislation passed at the federal level.
Yeah.
It's much easier to fight one battle. So, I kind of understand all of this, but politicians like to promise things, and they're like, hey, we're going to increase this, we're going to add this program, or we're going to, give you more child tax credits and all of this other stuff, and there's the moral hazard of the American people aren't actually paying for these programs. There's $30 trillion of debt that we're borrowed the money. So we haven't had to actually pay for this stuff. So we actually need to get to the point where the American people are actually paying for all of these programs. And then we will find out if the American people actually want to bear the burden of these costs, or of these programs, the cost of these programs. And we're going to find out pretty quickly what programs could be done more efficiently in other ways. So the taxes, effective tax rates, not just marginal tax rates. You always talk about, hey, back in the 70s, the marginal tax rate for the wealthy was like 90-something%. Well, I'm advocating that the taxes need to go up for just about everybody in this country. That the wealthiest 10%, they need to have their effective tax rates, which gets into tax policy, which needs to be simplified, but that's an entirely different show. But their effective tax rate needs to be close to 90%. The middle class needs to be somewhere between 40 to 50%. Even the lower class is going to need to pay 10, 15% of income tax, and the lowest people are still going to need to pay at least effective positive FICA taxes. Because the lowest number of people, or the lowest rungs of people right now, even though technically if you're employed, you're required to pay half of your FICA taxes, and then your employer pays the other half, unless you're self-employed, and then you pay all of it. But the lowest rungs, they have enough tax credits that they can actually get refunded their FICA taxes as well. So the net amount of money that they send to the government is zero. That needs to stop. End of discussion. Everybody needs to pay net FICA taxes, period. And that's a really hard thing to say, because when you look at a single mother with 2 children that is struggling paycheck to paycheck, where if she has even just a $25 extra bill that month, somebody doesn't eat, how do you look at them and say, well, I'm sorry, but you have enough tax credits right now that it offsets the amount of FICA taxes that you're paying? The problem with that is everybody needs to pay FICA taxes because everybody qualifies for Social Security. That's what you're paying, part of what you're paying in your FICA taxes. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of these programs are funded by FICA taxes. So everybody needs, those should be paid by everybody, period.
Okay, so let's break that down into a couple of different, because I think that it's gotten reasonably compounded, and so I want to. So and the question is why is this important? And it's because of essentially the debt. So we got several problems that we're discussing, because we've jumped from debt to moral hazard to the solution for fixing it. So first of all, you're never going to be allowed on a conservative show ever again. I'm just saying. So the effective tax rate should go up. You said on the upper upper 10% should be at least 90%, which is, where the effective tax rate now is like 13%. That's a pretty serious boost. Middle class have their taxes, which usually hover around 30%, bring that up to about 50%, and make sure that everybody's paying their taxes. And unfortunately, you end up with because a huge amount of the actual tax base is in the lower brackets, which is part of the problem that especially liberals want to fix. They're going to end up needing to pay taxes too. So I think I've got that part roughly. And so the question is, well, why? Now I want to use a liberal and a conservative example for this. The easiest conservative example is the U.S. military. The U.S. military, our U.S. military, we pay for we pay more than, essentially, give or take, like 2% more than every other country in the world combined. Most of the other countries, I think it's 24 of the top 26 other countries, are allies, and we pay more than all of them combined. We own over 90% of all the military base, foreign military bases. That's a base that is housed in a country other than the owner. And we do this as a projection of, and I can understand why, this seems like we got to deal with the Soviets, which we don't have to do anymore. We have to project U.S. power, but we're not paying for that as we expand it. And every time we keep expanding it, the debt goes up instead of us paying for it. So conservatives say we don't want to raise our taxes, but we do want to pay for the military, even when the Pentagon says we don't need any more money, stop giving us money, and then we order more because it doesn't cost that politician anything. That politician has only upside. If you're talking to conservatives, you go up to them and you say, I'm going to make sure we have the most advanced jets. I'm going to make sure we have the most bases. I'm going to make sure that we have the largest army ever. And because you're not going to be raising their taxes to do it, because you can put it into the deficit, that's a winning platform because it doesn't cost them anything. But because it doesn't cost them anything, they can keep voting for these people who are doing it and adding it to our deficit, which is past an untenable level. So that's on the conservative side, and then on the liberal side, any number of social programs which it's you can sit there and say I'm against poverty. We're all against poverty, but every program that we have conceived of, for the most part, not every, because I mean we are paying sort of some for some of them. There is money outgoing in the budget, but the deficit is it's not just the deficit, actually I should say the debt is growing significantly faster. So we are not paying for the bulk of these programs, and we keep adding programs, and then a program fails, we only half remove the program, and nobody bothers to clean any of this up because it's a pain in the neck. You'd have to pay attention. Somebody's making money off of it somewhere if the program's only half implemented and isn't working, but somebody's making money. And why am I going to bother overseeing it? Because of the moral hazard of the fact I don't have to pay for it because it's going into the debt instead of out of my pocket. Is that roughly it?
Yes. And who can be against? Like literally, if you vote for a new program and you're like, look, there are people that are hurting and struggling in the United States, and they need help, and I think that there is a moral obligation there to help them. The question is how do you do that? And how could you be against a program that's going to help these people? At least that's the goal of the program, is to help these people. You can get into the weeds and decide and argue whether it actually does help them or not. But how, in general, the principle of the idea is we're trying to help these people. How could you be against doing that unless you're just a bad person, if there's no cost to you? It's like, sure, I'm going to vote for that. It's like I'm going to pay the same, more or less, in taxes. I'm more worried about whether, there's a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. I don't particularly see much of a difference when it comes to spending between the two. Just Republicans like to borrow and spend. Democrats tend, not always, but tend to like to at least try and raise some taxes. They generally try and target the wealthy for this, because it plays well. And let's be honest, the wealthy probably aren't going to be hurt by the increase in taxes, although tax policy does influence behavior, and you're trying to attach more taxes to the people who have the most resources to avoid those taxes. It doesn't tend to go nearly as well as you think that it's going to go when you try and just tax the wealthy. It doesn't go as far
in reality as it does on paper, because it's the wealthy that can evade the taxes the easiest. Yeah.
And like Maya points out, it's like it's not just welfare programs, but I'm saying that that's where kind of a moral hazard comes in. Because how could you be against that? I mean, you're helping people. Like, how could you be against, a strong, powerful military, the strongest in the world, to make sure that our interests are being pursued around the globe to keep us safe here at home? And, it's like there's a great number of things that the federal government spends money on. But there is no real oversight of the American people saying, is this really what we want our hard-earned money going towards? Is this being used efficiently? Or should we get rid of this and try and find a better way of doing this? Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, all of them are unsustainable. They're all going to go into the red. They're not properly funded. And we know this. I mean, they haven't even tried to hide it. So not only do we have to actually pay for all of the things, and not just the budgetary things, not just budgetary shortfalls, because the federal government spends quite a bit more money than what's officially on the budget, which is why the debt is going up faster than the budgetary shortfalls.
Yes.
But we not only have to cover what we're actually spending in the United States on all of the things that the federal government spends money on. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be spending money on some of these things. I mean, disaster relief is probably a pretty good thing to spend some money on.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that they're all bad. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of very big inefficiencies and quite a large price tag attached that the American people aren't actually paying. So they don't have to decide whether the money that's being taken out of their pocket to fund all of these things that they're not going to get back. Regardless of what your situation is, you're contributing something to this. Then you've got skin in the game saying, hey, we need to find a better way of doing these things. And I believe that would eventually, it would hurt but it would eventually get people to be more responsible about what programs to pay a lot more attention to what programs are being involved. How is it going to be managed? We do this quite well with charities. I mean, there's several organizations out there that rank charities for the efficiency of the use of the funds that they get. But we have to go above and beyond that, because we've already obligated to pay $30 trillion that the government hasn't collected. So we have to be able to bring that down as well. So that's why I'm talking about, it's like pretty much almost everybody is going to have to start paying something. And Corpus did bring up something I'm actually in very big favor of, and that has to do with tax policy, and that's a national consumption tax or a national sales tax. And get rid of income tax, because you tend to get less of what you tax and more of what you subsidize. That's just kind of a generalized rule. So why would we want to be getting less incomes? Because, of course, we want people in America to have better incomes. So why would we be taxing incomes? Why not instead tax consumption? Some of the strongest economies built in the world, and the economy of the United States that built the United States into the powerhouse of a country that it is today, was built off of manufacturing, not consumption. And now we're a consumption-based economy, not a production-based economy. So there's lots of things that have shifted over the years, and it's the fact that we're not actually paying for the things that the federal government does. And I think that we would be a lot more analytical. We would examine things a lot more. We would look at programs that aren't working well, and we would be much more willing to get rid of them. We'd have politicians that be willing to stand up and point out just exactly how efficient a program is, and say, no, look, this is not a good use of our money. Here's a different proposal for this, or perhaps maybe we move it out of the purview of the government entirely. At least the people would be bearing the cost of all of the programs. And if you want a country to continue functioning, it has to be able to do that, because the path that the government, or that the United States is on, not just the government, but the United States is on, is not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. Math is a real thing. Economics is a real thing. And you can do lots of crazy things with it, especially when it has become as complicated as it is today, and not really face the consequences for a very long time. But you're building a problem, and those problems aren't simply going to go away. And nobody wants to pay the pain that it would take to correct these issues, because it's going to hurt.
So let me. I want to jump in on two things first, and then I want to start to wrap this up. So maybe shoot for another 15 or 20 minutes here. But Ed, I think we should have a show just dedicated on this. Bring on some economists and discuss it. But so first, the biggest problem is the debt right now is at a level that is going to do severe damage to this economy at some point. The reason is, at some point, people are going to realize we cannot pay it back. And some of it we don't have to pay back, actually. It depends on the debt gets really complicated. Some of it, that what's considered as the debt, is bonds that aren't necessarily you need to pay back. You just keep paying interest on. Eventually they mature, yada yada yada. But that if you want to keep issuing bonds, that's not necessarily the answer. But it's not all black and white. The debt is a very complicated thing, but it is big enough that it is not sustainable. And the problem is, the rest of the world will stop investing in us and stop using the dollar, which is what gives us so much financial leverage as the reserve currency, because the only way out of this debt is to print our way out of it. And that is devastating to an economy, ask Mexico. Now, and that's a reality. No matter what we want for welfare programs or military or anything like that, no matter what we need, if we need the military, or else the Soviet Union is going to come back and destroy us all, it doesn't matter whether we need it or not, because the debt is now at a point where, if it does, it will soon become an existential threat to this country if it is not already. But Maya brought up an interesting point, and I think this is actually kind of dovetails into what we're saying, what you're saying, and I concur with for the most part. Of course, I have to disagree with you on something, because we are contractually obligated to disagree on things. But she says, okay, there's nothing wrong with debt. I do tend to agree with that, and Xander and I may differ on that. It's not only that there's nothing wrong with that. Debt is actually a positive thing. Debt is how you start a business. Debt is how you do investments. You need to be able to have debt to run a modern economy. You cannot run a modern economy without debt. So I think you need a Federal Reserve. I think you need to make some influence. I'm a Keynesian, so I'm not an Austrian. So I think debt is a good thing, but like any good thing, too much of it. And, debt in and of itself isn't bad. We're not talking about debt being a bad thing. We're talking about 13 trillion in debt being a bad thing. Those are two different things. Even when it was
30,
3 trillion.
but not 13.
Sorry, 30. Yeah, thank you.
30.
30. Even when it was 3, it was a problem. It's 30. That's not, gee, that's okay. That's a serious problem. That is an existential problem at some level if we don't fix it. I agree debt is actually a good thing, actually, when you understand how it works. The ability to use and leverage debt is really important, but like anything, it can be abused. But I also want to point out that Maya had said, well, okay, but if you have to choose between military and social programs, which should you choose? Well, exactly. That's exactly the problem. We don't have to choose. Politicians do both. One reason we have kept exploding our military to this unsustainable level, where, by the way, we have to use them because otherwise they're sitting around rusting and not getting a return on our investment. We have to invade other countries. Why? Because we need to be able to leverage those countries to make us more money. That was the point of going into Iraq, because we can't sustain the military otherwise. That's what happened in Rome. You can't let your military get too big or else you have to start using it. We are in that position. Well, why didn't we slow down the military? Well, because it didn't cost us anything to increase it. It didn't cost us the social programs. We didn't have to choose. So Maya's point about making this choice, and I think I lost it because I think it was if you really cared about not spending money, we give money to poor children. I think she meant to say, and not to. Well, exactly, but we don't have to make that choice. That's the problem. The problem isn't. The problem is because we can do both without feeling the consequences. We're not making any choices. Our on either side, liberal or conservative, they can promise you anything. They can deliver on at least half. And why? Because the other side knows that if they can get, liberals know that they can pass any social welfare program, including Obamacare, including a complete overhaul of the nation's, a complete, quote, socialization of this nation's medical system. They could actually do that tomorrow if they wanted to. What they would have to do would be to sign off on conservatives getting any kind of big legislation through that they wanted. And it's not dollar for dollar. It's political influence for political influence. So if we wanted $4 billion to overhaul this nation's medical system, the conservatives could say, well, that's going to win you a lot of political power with your base, base as in your voting base. We want $200 billion for military spending. It would say, well, that's not, we'll give you $4 billion because that's what we're asking for, or 3, whatever the number was. But we're not going to give you that. And say, well, yeah, but we can't appease our voters with that. We're going to need more from you. Liberals sometimes, this is what the negotiation is. And the negotiation ends up not being about what's best for the country. It's about what can we give them to satisfy their base such that they'll give us what allows us to satisfy our base. And what's actually good comes in a distant second or third. And there are absolutely politicians who care about that, but we also see the politicians who care about that getting wiped the fuck out. And one of the reasons is because we don't suffer the consequences. So our politicians can lie to us. They can get away with it because we don't suffer the consequences and we don't care. So what happens is the Dems get what they want for political spending. The conservatives get what they want for political spending, and neither side pays for it. And we're okay with that because we're like, oh, well, hey, they got more military. So what? If we had to choose, I can think of nothing that would mobilize Democratic voters more than being told you have to choose between feeding the homeless or the military. Then you'd see Dems voting. You don't see that because they don't have to choose. And that's the problem. At least that's my take on it. So as soon as you realize that's the choice, then we can make it. We don't have to choose, and we do both poorly and end up with a debt that it strikes me at the level of existential crisis. I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Yeah, and you and I actually don't disagree as much as it might at first seem. It's like I don't mean to just specifically beat on welfare programs, for example, because amazingly enough, welfare programs aren't really probably what's bankrupting us. But you still have, it's like if you're proposing a social safety net and you're going to set up, says, okay, this is how much it's going to cost. Of course, that's always inaccurate, how much it's going to cost. And that's pretty much true of all spending bills. It's like, I swear to God, they move the decimal point a couple of spaces to the left and say, oh, this is what it's going to cost. No, move that decimal point a couple more points to the right, and they'll have a closer approximation of what it really will cost. But again, it's like I don't disagree that the debt in and of itself is bad. Debt can be leveraged for some very good purposes. But when you allow governments to go into debt when it isn't an emergency issue, you introduce a moral hazard. That's why we're where we are today. Debt in and of itself isn't a bad thing. I agree. People use debt, leverage debt all of the time, but they pay the debt back or they go bankrupt. That's the difference between when you say, well, debt can be leveraged. Yeah, it can. But in the case of the federal government, it can't go bankrupt, and it isn't paying it back. It's not increasing the taxes on its population. As long as the population is willing to actually bear the cost of the programs that it's instituting, then I don't particularly have much of a problem with it. It's like this is why I'm very skeptical of federal welfare programs, because they don't tend to be nearly as efficient as state-run programs, because states are a lot more nimble about it. But I'm not necessarily opposed to them.
California is going to have a different need than Massachusetts when it comes to welfare programs, in part because of a huge difference in climate. So a welfare program that allocates the same amount of money for roughly the same resources to each state is not going to be as effective as allowing each state to make its own decisions. And I think is roughly where you're going with that. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
So you're not against welfare programs per se. It's run by the federal government instead of by local governments. Is your objection, if I understand it correctly?
Yeah, I'm not particularly fond of them on the federal level, because it tends to get, the bureaucracy that's involved at the federal level just gets expounded, and it becomes more and more inefficient the farther and farther away. It becomes less responsive to the needs of the actual people. It's a lot harder to judge whether you're doing anything. It's like I prefer, obviously it's the conservative viewpoint is I want to keep as much government as close to the people as possible. Because the closer to the people it is, the more informed the people are about it, and the more control they have over it. And the more we can get rid of bad things and institute good things and find out which is which. And at the federal level, that's very difficult to do. It's like, I can go get a meeting with the mayor of my town, but I am not going to go get an interview with Biden. That's just not going to happen. So I would prefer to keep the governing as close to local as possible. And that's just my conservative view. I don't like the federal government being this big and doing this many things. It's spending a hell of a lot of money. And when you allow it to go into debt, and this is a sacrifice that you have to make in favor of avoiding the moral hazard of the federal government being able to go into debt. It's like, yeah, there could be several instances where it would be very beneficial for the United States to go into debt for certain things. Because you can leverage the debt for a greater use down the road, but that greater use has to be able to pay off the debt. And it's like, and I'm actually sympathetic to several of the Keynesian points about monetary policy. The problem is that even Maynard Keynes himself would look at the system that we have and say, what in the hell are you guys doing? This is not what I was talking about at all. You are not following the doctrine that I laid out. And it's like the last two major economic crises that we had, which was, the financial crisis, 2008, and the dot-com crisis of 2000. It's like, okay, well, most of the Austrian school economists predicted that those things were going to happen.
Well,
whereas
maybe reframe that. I'm not sure.
Like, full spade ahead.
Let me maybe switch that. most of the people who successfully predicted it were Austrian economists. I don't know if
Correct.
most Austrian economists predicted it, but I think the ones who successfully predicted
what I mean. Yes.
Okay. Well, let me. I don't want to. I want to address a couple points, and I want to start to wrap this up. To try to hit some points rapid fire. One, and if we got the impression, or at least I certainly wasn't trying, and I'm pretty sure Zandring wasn't trying to focus on social welfare. The point was it has to cover everything, and social welfare, we have more, even though social welfare programs take up less of the budget by a significant amount, we make more choices on them, and the point is, universally, it doesn't matter. We should be paying for every choice we make, and I think this country would look a lot different if we actually had to pay for everything we did. I think would be a lot more responsible across the board, not just social welfare programs, not just military, but with everything if we had to pay for it. The other problem is the attitude that we have right now is very similar to the attitude of the CEOs of the investment banks right as they were getting ready to fail. And I had a perfect example of that, of how our approach really to the economy is the same that they had, and that really concerns me. But that notwithstanding, we can't print our way out of this. We can, but the damage would be absolutely catastrophic. Yes, the U.S. is the world reserve currency. Because of that, we haven't had to suffer the consequences yet because we can leverage it. The second we can't leverage it anymore, the damage to the economy becomes catastrophic because the dollar loses a tremendous amount of power. It's also the same way in which the oh dear Lord, I must be getting tired because I keep losing my train of thought way too many times. We've been able to. There was something else that we've been able to leverage. Oh yes. This was the problem when the conservatives even talked about, or Republicans, I should say, when Republicans even talked about not paying our debt, we lost credit rating. And we went down from AAA to AA. That took a hit in the economy. If that had gone down to, say, a B, overnight interest rates across the country would have risen. Nothing else would have changed, but the interest rates would have skyrocketed. Why are the interest rates so good? Because the dollar is the reserve currency and because we pay our obligations. Because we pay our obligations, we get some of the best interest rates in the world. If that ever changes, the debt structure in this country blows up overnight. And we actually survived the last one, so yay. But that's why I think most of the audience, certainly myself included, were shouting at conservatives going, you don't play with this. These are our obligations to other people. Our credit rating is critical. And if it changes, it will be catastrophic to everybody in this country. And that's why we have to pay back our debts. But that's also why we can't print our way out of this, because if we print our way out of this, our credit rating goes out. And you have to keep in mind, printing necessarily causes inflation. And we've gotten into this with modern monetary economists, and everyone I've heard has dodged this question. And I've asked several professors on Vox's Discord when we were getting into this. And it was a dodge. It was very clearly, it was cute. The reality is, if you increase the amount of money that's out there, then the value of the money that's already there drops. So if there's $1 billion in circulation and you add another billion, then there's now $2 billion in circulation, and everybody who had that $1 billion loses half its purchasing power. They have the same amount of dollars, but they've lost half their purchasing power. That also happens with the debt. So if somebody is holding $1 billion in U.S. debt and the value of the dollar gets cut in half, and then we say, oh, here's your billion, we just printed it out. Yeah, but it's worth half as much if they change it to another currency. And they're aware of this, and they don't like the idea of this, which is why we don't do it. Why they would stop lending us money, they would stop investing in this country, and that would be a problem. So I strongly disagree that this is something we can print our way out of it. It's not until modern monetary theory that they've said that we could. And that's all great, but I haven't heard an explanation as to why this is true. I've heard well, you can't prove that inflation is caused by, mathematically I can show that that's what, well, we've never seen it. Well, we have seen it. Well, in those cases, there were other factors. Yeah, there were other factors, but we can account for them. All that notwithstanding, modern monetary policy has never been tested. It's not, there's a lot of people who are very concerned about it. I'm one of those people. It seems like wish thinking. It seems like, hey, listen, I want to believe it because it's a real simple solution to these problems. It means we can never go bankrupt. But since other countries have gone bankrupt before, I'm not sure it works that easily. And since it doesn't add up, at least in paper, on the way I understand it, I'm concerned. And I don't know that we should trust the entire government economic policy to a brand new theory that's never been used before. And I just realized I'm picking on Maya a lot, who's coming up with really good pushback, which is what we need. So I really don't want to be picking on you so much. So I'll move on. But I don't think we can print our way out of this. In fact, I am about as sure as I am of anything that we can't print our way out of this, because that's...
Ask Brazil. Ask Brazil, ask Ukraine, ask Zimbabwe, ask Mexico how it works. When you, even ask Britain quite a while ago. It's been a while since Britain tried this, but their pound sterling collapsed. Ask them how that works out for them when they print it. You can still go and get $1 million Zimbabwe dollar bills, because they had to actually start printing $1 million notes.
And again, the problem is we keep assuming that will work if the economy stays the same and it won't have a negative impact. But again, the problem is if we do that, nobody wants the U.S. dollar anymore. The value of the U.S. dollar against every other currency in the world plummets. And the impact to that on everybody on Main Street is catastrophic, because they get their goods from international trade about as much as your shirt says made in China. If our currency collapses and it turns over to the yen, I don't think that's something to dismiss. I think that's actually catastrophic to the U.S. economy, especially with the debt. And then nobody's ever going to borrow to us again. So even if we say, hey, debt is good, if U.S. credit is worthless because we just print our way out of debt and we devalue the debt by doing that, I think we're going to have a hard time finding people who want to loan us money, at least not at 13, 14, or 25%. We get loans now at 3%, and that's what's caused the growth of the 90s, was that great credit rating. I guarantee you that will vanish if we print money. To get out of this, we print money all the time because we have to, many reasons, but nonetheless. All right. Well, we'll have on economists.
One quick
please.
thing, because you mentioned the debt crisis of 2008, and that was a corporate debt crisis. And you want to know what saved a lot of pain and suffering?
I'm going to cut you off. Did Maya just troll me? Did she just troll my ass? Son of a... I'm too easy. I am just too easy. I'm too... Okay, that's... okay, I quit. I'm too easy. All right, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You were saying Maya's trolling my ass, and I'm sitting there going like, no, you can't do that. She's like, dude, nobody's that stupid. It's like, oh, sorry. Please continue. Sorry.
Well, they are doing a little bit of that. That's what quantitative easing in. The only reason it's not monetizing the debt is because they say that it's temporary. But we haven't stopped it since 2008. Well, they did start shrinking their balance sheet, but they never got it back down to zero. And before they had to reverse course and start quantitative easing again. But anyway, that's kind of tangential. 2008 was a corporate debt crisis. And who was there? How did they get out of that? Well, it's because the U.S. government, and this happened in many other countries around the world as well, because some other countries actually ended up with sovereign debt crises, like Greece and Portugal both had sovereign debt crises. But in the U.S., it was a corporate debt crisis, 2008, and it was the government that bailed them out for that. What we're cruising for right now is a sovereign debt crisis. Who's going to bail out the United States government when it has a sovereign debt crisis? And that comes into the danger of losing, because if there is actually a sovereign debt crisis in the United States, and it's significant enough, it's not just a minor bump in the road. We actually have a sovereign debt crisis. We're at very great risk of losing the status, the dollar losing the status of the world reserve currency. Now the world doesn't want to move off of the dollar because it would be a huge pain in the ass, and it would be very difficult on their own countries to try and come up with a new reserve currency, because everything is geared around the dollar already being the reserve currency. But if the dollar were to actually dramatically collapse, they would be forced to do it. And I have a feeling that they would end up going with something more like the euro, a basket of both commodities and currencies, to avoid the exact thing that's happening with the U.S. dollar now. So you can't have just one single country screw it up for everybody. So that is not something that wants to be done. It would cause a lot of pain. It would cause a lot of misery around the world. So they don't want to do it. But if there's a sovereign debt crisis in the United States, a significant one, it will happen. And one of the things that we're able to do, a lot of the things that we do, is, and why like our trade deficits don't really matter right now and haven't seemed to matter for the last 50 years. We're able to export quite a lot of our inflationary pressures overseas because everybody still wants dollars, because commodities are priced in dollars. So it doesn't matter if there's a trade deficit because everybody still wants our dollars. Well, when a reserve currency status of the dollar goes away, nobody's going to want dollars, and they're going to unload all of their dollars in favor of whatever basket of commodities or currencies that they would move to as a reserve currency. Well, all those dollars are going to come back to the United States, which means hyperinflation, and our dollar will no longer be worth anything. You won't be able to buy anything. I mean, it'd be, you could buy stuff with toilet paper sheets faster than you could buy something with $100 bill. And that actually happened in Zimbabwe. So it's not like this can't happen to us. And we have a hell of a lot of, we are in a privileged position because we own the reserve currency for the world. And we have to be careful not to, screw that up. And we can. But, that's kind of
we are right now. We're on track for it. It's hard to see how we're going to avoid it actually at this point, but please continue. Sorry to interrupt. It's just like,
no, it's just that, that's kind of a bit of aside from the moral hazard of not actually paying. It's like, I agree that debt can be good. You can leverage debt for really good reasons, but if you allow a federal government to go into debt to do this, even though it may be of benefit to the whole country as a whole, it introduces the moral hazard of not having to immediately pay for the things you have your government do, and we end up kind of where we are today.
So,
because it was a good idea to allow the government to go into debt because you want it to be able to leverage debt, but it led us to this point where it's like, this is insane.
So there's a couple of fundamental problems, and I think I want to try to wrap this up into as easy a package and framing as I can. One fundamental problem is every tool that you give anybody that is some kind of privileged tool or privileged power will eventually get used and abused. And we all know this. That's why there's a First Amendment. That's why we have so much oversight. And the First Amendment's our most powerful oversight because we know people in government will eventually start to abuse their power. We know that when businesses are given certain powers and certain exemptions, at first they use them properly, and then eventually they abuse them, and eventually, so it just happens, and you have to keep an eye out for it. Plenty of people become officers because they want to be police and they want to help their community, and then you give police officers certain powers, and eventually those start to get abused if there isn't oversight. It's not because they're bad people; it's because we all do this. We find ways to justify it, and usually we're even justifying it with good intent. We've seen police officers sometimes planting evidence. So we got plenty of videos of that. And sometimes it's because they're bad people. Sometimes it's because they're like, well, look, this is the only way the system works, and we need to bust people we know are doing bad. But that's not how the system works, and they're not supposed to for very good reasons. So what we have is right now, the left and the right agree on one thing that nobody thinks about, but they agree on. They want to stay in office. That's what they agree on. And they're willing to horse trade with each other for things that aren't in the best interest of this country, but are in the best interest for them being able to satiate the people who voted for them, because they all have that in common. And it doesn't really matter if they generate results. It matters if they look like they generated results. And that's where it's the exact same thing as the corporations in 2008. All of those corporations did not need to produce long-term results. They needed to produce short-term results. That's all they needed. And so they deliberately sacrificed the long-term to get those short-term results so that they could keep getting their golden parachutes and all their money and so on and so forth. And that's what politicians are doing today on both sides. And in many cases, doing it together because that's the one thing they have in common and they can help each other with. So they can disagree and argue and fight over all these other things. But the one thing they all agree on is they want to stay in office and they have to bring something home to their constituents. And they have to do it almost at any cost or they're not going to get into office. And the people who are willing to have integrity and honesty when they go in find the game very much rigged against them because everyone else is willing to lie, cheat, and steal. And somebody else says, I'll give you all of these things and you won't have to pay for it. Says, no, I'll give you this and this and your taxes will go up just a touch. Or I can give you this, this, and this, and they're going to go up a lot. But right now, we'll shoot for these because they're realistic. Whatever you say you vote for, I don't care. What you vote for, in general, you as in just the people in general, is the guy who promises all these things and says you're not going to pay for it. That's what we do, and we say we want politicians who won't lie to us, but time and time again, we prove that's not really what we want. So they get into power, and because there are no consequences to those actions, at least not immediately, we allow them to do exactly what caused the 2008 collapse, which is to short long-term interests in order for short-term gains that look great on paper. But the bill always comes due. It came due in 2008. It very nearly ended the U.S. economy. It didn't, thanks to some liberal socialism. Sorry. It must have been I think it was was it a liberal socialist idea that bailed? I think it was. I'm just saying. But we'll get into that because there's another side of that one too. But I can't not take pot shots at his Andring. All that notwithstanding, we have a debt that is unsustainable. Right now that I'm aware of, there is no credible means for ending the debt without having a catastrophic effect on the economy. We can't print our way out of it. Right now, we have no means to pay it. Is Andring I suspect, I'm not sure, I haven't done the math, but saying raising the effective tax rate on the wealthiest Americans to 90%, on middle Americans to 50%, and on graduated at lower levels, but basically everybody pays something. That strikes me as probably being about what you'd need to do to A, pay for what we're funding, and B, lower the debt, because that's what you have to do. And again, you don't actually have to lower the entire debt. You really don't. But at $30 trillion, you can't leave that. And this isn't a problem that's going to go away. This isn't a problem that can be ignored. And it looks to me on paper like we're talking an existential threat to the U.S. economy, at least as big as what happened in 2008. At least that big. At least that. I'm not kidding. If there's somebody out there that knows other, please
it will be
come
bigger.
on the show. Yeah, I can't
it
imagine
will be
how
bigger.
it wouldn't be. I'm being conservative. I can't fathom it wouldn't be bigger. But if somebody knows an economist, and we should have on an economist, because I think we really wanted to talk about, and we went on to bigger issues, which is great. I mean, that's what we do. We'll bring on an economist. I'm not entirely uneducated on the subject. In fact, I've opined quite saliently in a number of areas, so I have some idea of what I'm talking about, but that's fine. I'm willing to cede. I'm not an economist, so we'll bring an economist on. I haven't heard anyone contest any of these issues, again, except for modern monetary policy theorists, and that's a brand new school and has no credible support or evidence supporting their claims that I'm aware of. It's marvelous. I kind of hope they're right, because if they're right, then we can solve this. But if they're not, I think we've got an extraordinarily serious problem on the horizon that would affect our status as the holder of the default world currency. It would affect all of our interest rates, and it would affect everything that the U.S. dollar can buy everywhere, and would see inflation the likes of which you've never seen. We bought a lot of things we can't afford, and so because we don't have the moral hazard of having to pay for them, and we haven't had to, because the country, the politicians on both sides have continually gotten into office by giving us more than they actually can, because we're not engaged in this oversight. And both sides have an interest in helping the other side do that some, because it's like the brother and sister who hate each other, but when it comes to stealing the cookies from the parents, they'll work together. It's really that simple. So that we end up with this problem of nobody wants to talk about the debt. Nobody wants to think about the debt. It looks to me to be a looming crisis well in excess of 2008. And the only way I see us dealing with it is to start to say something at a minimum like never spend another dime unless it's accounted for somehow. And that's not going to happen. So the question is, how are we going to fix this? And right now, nobody has given me any credible alternatives. And that's getting more and more scary the more I look at the numbers. And 2008 was predicted by a large number of people. And a number of people are saying we're headed for something much worse because of 30 trillion. I don't see how 30 trillion is sustainable. But all that aside, really, what got us here, a huge part of what got us here was moral hazard. The consequences for choices, even if they were great choices, even if they were the best choices you could make, every good choice has a consequence. Every choice has a consequence. And everybody you help, if it was consequence free, would be helping everybody all the time. We don't, because there's limited resources. It's a limited resource planet. We haven't had to pay those consequences, but that's not really true. They've just been accruing. We've been pretending we don't have to pay them. We do have to pay them. We will have to pay them one way or another, and with interest. And that number is unimaginably high right now, and the only reason people aren't panicking about it is because politicians aren't panicking about it. And I think they are panicking about it, but they're pulling a Bernie Madoff. Bernie Madoff wasn't terrified. He knew at some point it had to end, but he was just wish-thinking that he's going to get bailed out of this. But on paper, it was going to end, and it was going to end badly. That's where the U.S. seems to be now, and I found nobody who can disagree with me on that, but we're all like, well, we'll figure something out. That didn't work very well for Bernie Madoff. It hasn't worked well for anybody else in this position. So I do think moral hazard. I find it interesting. I think you're the one who pointed this out as a hindering, so I appreciate that, because I think that's moral hazard is actually probably the biggest reason for this. And whatever the programs, whether they were military spending or not, but it's easy for someone to come up and say, "Yeah, I support our military." Great. Are you willing to raise taxes? No, I support our military in lowering taxes. Okay, how does that work? Well, get the right politician. It works very well, at least for the short term. But again, Bear Stearns made a lot of money in the short term, too. So did Goldman Sachs. So did Lehman Brothers. Works very well for a period of time. We're not very good at this long-term thinking. This is a problem. I think the moral hazard is the big cornerstone of it. Anyways, any last minute? Sorry, I went on longer than I should have. I gotta stop these just moralizing at the end of the show for 30 minutes. Anyways, so any last minute thoughts before we bail?
No, I just think that, it's like it started off with the best of intentions, but because of the moral hazard of not actually, having to pay for everything up front, that it has slid into very dangerous territory. It's like it is, the economies of the world, especially today, how interconnected they're getting, and how much more complex things are getting. It is amazing the kinds of things you can get away with doing for at least a while. Like right now, a $30 trillion federal debt is sustainable. We can actually do this. Of course, it's not staying there. It's rising almost exponentially at this point. And the fact that, the Fed funds rate is at 0% interest. Real interest rates are negative right now. It's like you cannot tell me that 2 years ago, when we had a 2.5% interest rate, Fed funds interest rate, and the CPI was sitting at below 2%, and the federal government, we now have an official CPI of like 7.5% for January, and our Fed funds rate is at 0%, and they're only talking about raising it 2% over the next 2 years. It's like, well, if we had an economy where inflation wasn't an issue, and we had a 2.5% interest rate, and we couldn't maintain it, they had to drop it back down to 0 because the economy was beginning to tank because they were raising it too fast. How in the heck do you think that we're going to stop inflation with a 2% increase over 2 years when inflation is now officially, by the official numbers, I should say, 7.5%?
And
like this isn't going to work out.
and I know where you're going with this, and this is another one, those official numbers have been changed for the same reason of all these other things, which is it's easier to get people who aren't paying attention to move if you have the numbers favorable to you. The poverty rate in the U.S. was dramatically underrecorded for a very long time. And every president or every new administration has had the opportunity to correct the poverty data. And I forget who finally did it. And I don't even know that it's correct. I just know that it's more accurate. But it's been wildly inaccurate. We've had many more people in this country in poverty than has been reported. But the reason is because people want to show that they're good on poverty, so they use numbers that don't accurately report it, so that it looks like we have had more success. And we re-elect the people in power who are, by the way, the ones who have numbers of poverty numbers that are wildly underreporting it, but they use a measure that's just not accurate. They know it's not accurate. Kind of the same thing with unemployment. And there are very good reasons actually for using unemployment the way it's been used, but it's wildly inaccurate. It's like when more people start going to work, the unemployment figures go up. The unemployment figures go up when more people start going to work. Why? Well, because unemployment doesn't count people who have quit and have given up on getting a job. They've said, well, I can't get work. I've been turned down by everybody else, and so they're living in abject poverty and not even trying anymore. When the economy improves and all of a sudden they have prospects, they start trying to get a job, and so now they're counted in unemployment, even though they hadn't previously been counted in unemployment, even though they were in fact unemployed, because they wanted a job, but they had given up trying. So in order to be counted for unemployment, you have to be actively trying. And there are very good reasons for that. One reason was they didn't want to count, when they first created the unemployment index, they didn't want to count, for example, mothers who worked at home, because they said, okay, they're not trying to get a job outside, so we don't count them as unemployed because they're not trying to get a job in industry somewhere. So they're taking care of the family, so they shouldn't count towards unemployment, which is, of course, accurate. But a whole swath of unemployed fell into that, and it's never been correctly reported. There's now 2 indexes for unemployment. They've created a second index to take into account people who have given up, who can't get a job, who would start working tomorrow if there was one out there. But if you're in the dust bowl, you're out of it. And
well, there's more than 2, because there's the and I'm blanking on the rate, but there's like ones that are there's like unemployed, underemployed. That's another reading. So they've got like 3 or 4 different ones, and then you have the ones that count the people who have that includes the labor participation force, which is probably the most accurate.
But the CRB Vegas, $2, and this is exactly so. The CRB Vegas has hit on the point that we're trying to say. So inflation is currently, they're talking about between 7% and 8% right now. But the problem is that the number
as of January's numbers, it was 7.5.
Okay, 7.5 as of January. The problem is the figure they're using is bad, and it's deliberately bad. They know it's bad. They don't fix it. But it was adjusted. I think you know better than I do when it was adjusted. When was it adjusted to pull out certain factors?
It was in the mid-90s. Yeah, it was in the mid-90s when they changed it, and they changed several different ways that they calculated it. And the official reason that they did that was because they said that the previous calculation over-exaggerated inflation. Now, you also have to realize that there are many, many government programs that have COLA, cost of living allowances, every year that is tied to the inflation rate. So whatever the inflation rate for that year is, that's the percentage amount that that program has to be increased, that everybody gets. Like Social Security, for example, is mandated. It has to go up by whatever the inflation rate is every year, so that it ostensibly maintains the purchasing power. So it is in government's best interest to understate the amount of inflation so that they can save a hell of a lot of money in COLA increases. And I believe that's probably the biggest reason why it was done. If you calculate the CPI, and there is a guy out there that he got banned from YouTube, but he maintains all of the numbers and calculates them the exact same way that they were calculated in 1980, which was the highest inflation ever recorded in the United States at 13.7%. If you calculate today's CPI and today's inflation numbers by the same metrics used in 1980, our inflation rate is over 15%. It's like 15.3% as of January, which means that, as of January, January's numbers, I should say, we currently have the highest inflation that has ever been recorded in the United States. They keep saying, oh, well, it's like the second highest or third highest, since 1983, which it was like 8%. But the difference there is it was coming down at that point. Right now it's going on its trajectory up, not coming down. But if you use the same metrics to calculate the inflation rate, this year has been the highest ever recorded.
Well, and you brought up a great point about COLA too, because everybody who knows anybody whose life is tied to that number, they will tell you that somehow that number does not seem to accurately reflect reality, because as living gets harder, that number is not going up commensurate. And the government is incentivized to keep that number as low as possible because it keeps the debt down. But it doesn't keep the debt down by being responsible. It keeps the debt down by failing on our obligations. And part of this is also what happened with the VA, where it's like, well, let's make sure that veterans who suffered for this country aren't getting let's really make sure that they've got PTSD before we try to treat it, because it's really expensive to treat. And I want to say we've been shitting all over a lot of people and politicians, and some politicians deserve a lot of shitting on. But I think the average one does come in with a tremendous amount of optimism and really wants to help, and then has to end up making these choices because they're in an impossible situation. You can't govern if you're not elected. I don't care how good your ideas are. I don't care how many lives you can save. I don't care how compassionate you are. If you don't get elected, it's worthless. So a lot of compromises end up getting done in the name of being elected, and it makes it very hard we can maybe elect one or two stellar people. Even they have to make compromises, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But to elect any number of really great people to fix this, and one great person can't do it on their own. So it's sort of like the responsibility is, as you would expect in a constitutional republic, on us, and we've been really asleep at the wheel, which is a problem. And they've encouraged that. So they end up cutting a lot of corners because they're in this impossible situation. They have to make ends meet, or at least look like they're meeting. Especially in order to get elected, they have to keep us happy. They have to balance a budget that can't possibly be balanced, and so they're like, "Yeah, let's if we can calculate these numbers in a more conservative way, as long as it's fairly justifiably accurate, let's do it." Well, that's a pretty low bar when you're talking about people's livelihood.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's political suicide. I mean, it's like if you were to come out and say, "Look, the actual cost of living adjustments for all of these programs where it's mandated to have it, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, VA benefits all have COLA attached to them." So, you can't come out and say, this is raising our debt way too much. We can't do this. Or we have to raise your taxes, or we have to cut the benefits. And as soon as you say we have to raise your taxes or we have to cut your benefits, I mean, you're pretty much shooting yourself in the foot, if not in the head. It's like, they're put into an impossible position. So it's like, okay, so how do we get around this? Okay, well, the previous numbers were overstating inflation, so we're going to make a few of these adjustments to try and get a more accurate view of inflation. Of course, people who really looked into this and saw what kinds of changes they made are like, this is ridiculous. I think one of the most grievous examples is owner equivalent rent, which makes up a third of the CPI number. That's 1/3 of the CPI number, and we have markets that tell us exactly what people are paying for rent, what people are paying for houses. We have those markets, we have those numbers. We don't use them. Instead, they use a poll, and they ask homeowners if you had to rent your house to yourself.
Yeah.
If you had to rent your house to yourself, how much would you rent it for? And they use that number instead. That's 1/3 of the CPI. And it's like, what are you doing here? So, I mean, that's a particularly grievous one. It's not the only change they made, but it is one of them. They also came out with hedonics, which is another kind of, anyway, you could almost do an entire show just on how the changes in the CPI have been made. But, they do this because, they're pushed up against some realities. And they can't just come out and say, look, you're either going to need to do this or you're going to need to do this, because there's going to be another politician that can say, no, I could give you the world and you don't have to pay for it. And that's the person that will get elected. They can't actually do it, but that's how they're going to get elected. So, and if you actually were to try and do some of these things, like actually cut benefits because it's costing too much, or raise taxes, or allow the debt to explode even faster than it is now, it's like there is no good solution here. So, I mean, we've gotten ourselves into quite a pickle, and I'm not entirely sure how we can even get ourselves out of it, but we should at least be trying to. At least stop digging. We're in a hole. Stop digging.
Put the shovel down. And I think we need to take and listen. It's always the when the corporations got their bailouts, it was the everyday man who suffered some of the biggest consequences, and a lot of them got. How many of them ended up? One guy ended up in jail over the financial crisis, and it was for doing something really illegal. He obviously should have gone to jail, but it was being done by 20 other people. So, we owe some of this because we're not holding our politicians to account, and on some level that's even a good thing, because the whole point of electing representatives to govern is so that we can live our lives, because we can't become experts on foreign policy, on all the things that we need to become an expert on. So we elect other people, and that's their job, so that they can do it better than we can. But the problem is we've given up on oversight, and we've given into sort of wish thinking. And that has always bitten everybody who's done it in the ass. And I think we had a preview of it in 2008, and it looks like this is coming down the pike again. Anyways, we'll get on an economist to talk about it, because I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's worthy of discussing it, in as much as, a huge problem is we haven't addressed the political incentives for the politicians to not accurately report things to us, and for us to listen to the fairy tales we're being told. And I think that's a serious problem, and that really does cut across both sides of the aisle, I think. When I think of that, the first ones I think about is the oppressive Soviet Union that's going to end us. I was in the Soviet Union, and most of that was all hot air. They loved Americans. They loved Americans. They were very proud of their country, and I'd been told that of everybody who'd ever been there. And then I was there for a month, and I remember I was just like, I was told you guys all hate Americans. Like, oh, we love America. They're like, we love jeans. We love this. We love. And then they're like, and then I met a woman, and she was a child when she met her first American from World War II. And I was like, she'd been in, I have no idea where she was. And she told me the story, but I was a kid. I wasn't listening. I was a teenager. I didn't realize the significance of it. How Americans had saved her and her family in World War II. And, they loved us, but this idea that every Soviet wanted every American dead, and they were all going to, and it was a great way to get elected. It was a great way to run on fear. Losses loom larger. We're fear driven, and if we're going to evolve, and if we're going to try to, we have to be a little less of that. That served us well. We wouldn't be alive here if we weren't that way. That's an evolutionary holdover, but it's a problem. All right. Well, this show could easily keep going on forever. As Andring, most of the topics that we talked about tonight were things that you had brought up, and I really enjoyed discussing with you. So I'd like to thank you for bringing them up and being willing to discuss them with me in private, so that we could say, hey, let's go discuss this shit on air. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming on air to discuss it, because I think that was an interesting conversation.
Well, despite the rep that a lot of kind of more conservative people, and of course I'm in a bit of a unique position because I am very liberal when it comes to social issues, but I get, when it comes to like fiscal and governmental issues, I'm fairly conservative. So I have a weird kind of split there, but I actually care about the welfare of the country. I care about the people who are actually suffering. And I think that there has to be a better way. And, there's even been some pretty liberal policies that have been proposed that I'm like, you know what, give it a try, because what we're doing right now certainly isn't working. And it's like the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. It's like, okay, well, we need to change some things, or things the real world won't change. So, like, okay, if you can't get support for what I think would probably be the best solution, of course, people are going to get hurt, and it's going to start, putting some people under personal responsibility, or add more personal responsibility. Just what we need in a world today is to add even more stuff to people's plates. But maybe your program will work. I don't know. I don't think it will, but we need to change. We need to start changing things. So it's like if we can get support to change something, at least get that changed. And, we should be able to see, at least if people are being somewhat honest, we'll be able to see if things are getting better or worse. And we need to be able to be a little bit more nimble in our ability to change courses if things aren't getting better and start getting worse. But we need to start changing things. This path is not sustainable. It will eventually fail. It's been working okay, and I use that term loosely, so far. But this is not sustainable. It cannot go on forever, and it won't go on forever. And I fear that there's going to be a hell of a lot of pain to go around when this comes apart. And I would really rather avoid that. I kind of like having a life where I can go to work and earn a living, and I can come home to a gorgeous wife that loves me to death. And I don't want to have a financial collapse where I'm wondering how am I going to make enough money to buy a loaf of bread next week. So
which happened.
Things need to change.
And that has happened in so many industrialized countries. We don't think about it. France was the one I was thinking of because of actually protests. But our plates. You had said that we all have a lot on our plate. We do and we don't. Our plates weren't designed for what we have on them right now. For 100,000 years, human beings had to worry about where they were going to get all their food from, where they were going to, how they were going to survive the winter, how they were going to hunt and, survive in very cold, nasty, brutish, and short environments. We haven't had to worry about that for a blink in terms of human evolution, but at least in terms of just raw data, we've been doing very, very well. We're not geared to worry about these things, and we're geared to sort of ignore them because we're geared for more immediate existential crises. That's how we got to where we are today. But if we don't start to take it seriously, we're going to end up back there. And I really kind of like that when you say there's a lot on my plate. Yeah, that lot on my plate is how my girl's going to get to college. How am I going to survive the latest round of attacks on social media? Or who's going to win the Super Bowl? What do I do about a friend of mine who's in serious distress? And how do we solve problems that are affecting people less fortunate than us? I much prefer a huge helping of those problems than a reasonably smaller helping of, okay, you're living in a cave, how are you going to survive the winter? And what are you going to do for food? And to try to keep your family alive. So I'm perfectly happy with the size of what's on my plate right now. Quite frankly, I get stressed out, but every time I do, I was just like, well, my plate's looking pretty good. All right. Well, thank you very much, Xandring. Anyone who wants to join us, please, come on in on the Discord, and we'll continue this conversation. And I think this is a topic we try to do, shows in series, and we're still trying to find what's going to be our next one. It may be on economics. Yay. But it's worth knowing, and it doesn't. Moral hazard is one of those that's very worth knowing and understanding, because once you understand it, it changes your view, I think, on most things. But all that notwithstanding, thank you. And I see, I've got a panel here, and it looks like there have been a number of people who've been watching for the whole time. So thank you guys all so much for your support. Thank you for the super chats. We got several super chats. It's always great, and we appreciate it. And everyone here works.
I have one last thing too.
Please. All right. Yes, go for it.
And it's directed toward Tiffereth X in the chat. Get away, witch.
Ho. Okay. Yep. So, hold on one second. I got to do this right here. Hi there. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and I would like to remind you that the views and opinions of any one host on In Time does not necessarily reflect the views of everybody on In Time. So please remember this. If a host happens to say something mildly aggressive to any members of the audience, thank you for this consumer alert. Please continue with the show. All right. Yeah, I already suspected who she was. About to make a condescending comment towards my own, and I was like, nope. I'm gonna try to stay out of the doghouse if I can. So that's always a challenge for me. All right, well, so anyways, thank you all for your support. It really helps out. We try to be as educated and informed as we can be, and to try to find interesting topics to discuss and guests to discuss them with. So, like and subscribe is one great way of helping out. It really is. That's why you hear every channel ask for it. That's why I'm asking for it now. The other thing you can do is not a witch of your wife. Oh, dear Lord. I should have seen that one coming. I can't believe I missed that it was the bride. Okay. So all that notwithstanding, and thank you for those who super chatted. Come on to our Discord, talk about this or any number of other topics. We've always got lots to talk about. We will be seeing you tomorrow for overtime, and I would like to do like an actually scheduled after dark, get his Andring on, and I think we've hit on a lot of topics for the last couple of weeks that we haven't had the opportunity for people to come in and tell us why we're wrong. So we'll do an after dark, and everyone can come on in, and we'll have those discussions next week. Homozygote will be on, and we will be talking philosophy of science. Yes.
And don't forget, you can always tell us how wrong we are in the comments.
Yes, and the comments, definitely. We read all the comments. We reply to most of them, which is a bit of a problem because, the trolls that know me, and especially from Twitter, they're like, oh, he thinks everything's a genuine conversation, so they can say just about anything. And I'm just like, wait, no. And it's like all my buddies, like I got 20 friends, like, you realize he's a troll, right? No, he's just a well-meaning, a misinformed person. No, he's a troll. Why would you assume that? Here's a list of him trolling 300 people in the past. Okay, but past does not indicate future performance. This is the one issue. I know he wants to have an honest. No, Nick, he's a troll. Yeah, I don't. So we read your comments, we answer them even when we shouldn't. So please leave a comment, like, subscribe. Thank you, Xandering. Thank you, all of those of you with the super chat. I don't think you're a witch, and I personally chastised him about forgetting Valentine's Day. When was that, by the way? Was that like yesterday? That was yesterday, right? Okay, so I gave him a hard time about missing Valentine's Day because that's the kind of guy I am. All right. Thank you all, and we will see you tomorrow.
Have fun storming the castle.